Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I don't know if I'm going to be talking for an hour and have you listening to me for an hour for two reasons. It's just after lunch, and this is the worst time for listening to anybody. The food is just settling nicely. But the second is I flew from Cape Town yesterday overnight, and because of the time difference, I haven't slept. I think now it's coming close to 40 hours. So I'm going to read much more than I'm comfortable with, but I thought I would just talk to you about disruption and South Africa. But before I start, let me thank Dr. Gilligan and Dr. Quack for putting together this program. It's so refreshing to engage with scholars from different disciplines. As the dean of a law school, can you hear me? Oh, I've got a mic here. You can't hear me? Let me see. How's that? Okay, so then I'll just take this. So as dean of a law school, you're sort of wading in law and judges and alumni and career and so on. So this is very refreshing. You all have the abstract of my paper, which is sort of about the creation, the making of the South African Constitution and the creation of a constitutional democracy, and I'm using the word creation very broadly here, in the wake of 400 years of colonialism and 40 years of apartheid. So this disruption from authoritarianism to democracy. So let me just start by saying that South Africa, up until maybe 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, regarded itself as quite a unique country. The events of the last 15 years have shown that we're just like any other country globally with democracy and so on. But the uniqueness of South Africa was South Africa's place in the global imagination, and particularly the impact of the anti-apartheid movement on international law and particularly human rights law. Now, in my abstract, I said that I would look at the influence of international law on the South African Constitution. I'm going to be focusing mostly on human rights law, international human rights law, because the creation of the apartheid state, of the post-apartheid state, was a purposive, deliberate effort to create this human rights polity, one that would be an example at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, a sort of success, a sort of vindication of 50 years of human rights activism since the start of certainly since the establishment of the United Nations. And the South Africa, after the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, I have another South African I met this morning who's a mentor or a fellow. After the release of Mandela in 1990, between 1990 and 1994, for the first election, South Africa was one large constitutional law workshop. Everybody from everywhere came to contribute to putting together this document. And so it was wonderful for South Africans. I was not living in South Africa at the time, but every time I ran into somebody in the United States or Canada or Australia or someplace, that told me about their contribution to creating this constitution. So what I want to do is reflect on the role of international law, as I said, and specifically the question about global norms, this universal consensus about human rights in a local place in which the majority of citizens in effect don't have the kinds of connections, the real connections around this universal consensus. So let me just sort of go back. As I mentioned, apartheid was deemed a crime against humanity in the 1960s, and many resolutions of the United Nations focused on apartheid. So when you look at the development of anti-racist principles, particularly in international human rights law, you see that much of it is a sort of response to apartheid. Earlier on, of course, to the ravages of Nazism and so on during the Second World War. What is also very interesting about South Africa is that it was law that essentially kept the processes of apartheid in place. People think of apartheid as this authoritarian, violent place with security police officers and the military and disappearances and torture and so on. That was part of apartheid, but the most effective part of apartheid was law. People obeyed the law, while at the same time they undermined the law as well. So it was the process of law that kept apartheid in place, and now it is the processes of law and constitutionalism, and particularly the input of international law, that is supposed to keep and certainly give much of the strength to this new constitutional democracy. So apartheid was, the laws of apartheid, one has to understand that the laws of apartheid were not just, separate toilets and separate parks, and people couldn't marry who they wished, and racial classification and security laws and so on. The racism and sexism was patriarchy was deeply embedded in the DNA of South Africa, a deeply authoritarian state. So what makes this transition from apartheid to democracy so interesting is because you have an overlay of liberal constitutionalism in a sort of political and a citizenry that's been steeped in deep authoritarianism. And later on when I talk about the obstacles to this consensus around human rights and the internalizing the Constitution, part of what the answer is this deeply entrenched authoritarian, patriarchal, racist system. So let me just, sorry. Okay, the wrong way. All right, so just, I mentioned earlier the end of apartheid. And in 1990, one has to go back to look at 1990 and look at just the years, the 2 years prior to 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this new global consensus about the rule of law, about constitutionalism, where liberalism was on the sort of increase, and the idea was that liberal democracies, rule of law projects, constitutionalism was in many ways the dominant way in which countries should constitute themselves. For South Africa, it was particularly difficult because the liberation movement that had up to then represented South Africa and had made a commitment about the new post-apartheid order was very much steeped in policies of redistribution, socialist policies, very strong support from communist countries. And the language of South African post-apartheid governance was always about redistribution. Come 1990, 89, 1990, you see the language of redistribution being replaced by the language of rights. And the anti-apartheid struggle is now framed as a global human rights struggle, that people begin to use the words, the dominant words of the global order about rights and constitutionalism. And so during the negotiations and the release of Nelson Mandela, there had to be a shift in the framing of what this new post-apartheid order would look like. And many of you may know this, that the last apartheid prime minister, later president, de Klerk, in effect, started the process of unraveling and releasing Mandela and other prisoners from prison many, many years before. And the idea was that the world was moving in a particular way, and the apartheid government really wanted to, in many ways, benefit from this new shift. And this new shift also gives one an idea about the limitations that the Constitutional Court and that the Constitution has imposed on South African societies to some extent when we think about disruption, when we think about transformation. Oh, sorry. Again, going back. Now, one of the other developments in international law that also occurred during this period was this idea about sort of deliberation and negotiation, the idea that conflicting parties did not just sit down together and try and achieve a consensus around the major principles. But part of what was to happen as well was after the conflict. How do we deal with the conflict? And I would argue, and many scholars have made this argument, that up until this point, it was clear, certainly the international consensus was, that those who committed gross violations of human rights ought to be punished. And in South Africa, the conversation was a very, very different one. You begin to see the beginnings of notions of restorative justice around truth and reconciliation. You see Rudy Titel's work and so on about transitional justice. And you begin to see in the negotiations not just what the Constitution would look like, but how the perpetrators of a system that had been deemed a crime against humanity would be dealt with. Now remember the great moment of I'm using again the word great here in inverted commas, of punishment for gross violations of human rights, genocide, crimes against humanity, was really the Nuremberg model, the trials, the idea that, as I said, those who committed gross violations of human rights would be punished. In South Africa, during these deliberations, you begin to see the development of notions of restorative justice, transitional justice. And you see an institution, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, begin to gain ground, and actually one sees also the development of a fairly sophisticated scholarship around Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And at a very practical level, South Africans during this period of negotiations started looking at other models of truth commissions. The most prominent were Argentine, many other South American countries. But the idea was that El Salvador and so on, how could South Africa, the question was, how could South Africa deal with these criminals? And amnesty was what had been the major feature of many of those truth commissions, blanket amnesty. South Africa was not going to grant blanket amnesty, and so you begin to see the development of a particularly South African kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission with very, very clear, a clear articulation of how amnesty is accorded and what kinds of acts would justify amnesty. I'd mentioned earlier, as I said, this idea, the international context, this triumph, as I said, of liberal democracy, the collapse of communism, and so on. And that moment was a very, very important moment because one sees if we look at 2018, with Donald Trump as the President of the United States, with the kinds of political developments in Europe, and this idea that the universal consensus around liberal democracies, around human rights, is being frayed. It's a very, very different moment. And in fact, somebody made a joke the other day at a constitutional law a workshop that I went to and spoke about the perfect timing of Nelson Mandela, because this person claimed if Mandela had been in jail during 9/11, before 9/11 and just after, there would be no South Africa, because the ANC was declared a terrorist organization by Americans, and so the history of South Africa would have been very, very different. So that is the international context, and I think it's an important context because it really gives you an idea of the kinds of tensions and the struggles and the limitations, as I said, about the discourse, the text, the interpretation of the Constitution. Of course, today in South Africa, there's a generational as well as an intergenerational as well as an ideological struggle happening about the Constitution and the negotiations that took place, the negotiations I showed on the earlier slide, because the sense from younger people particularly is that this compromise was too much, that Mandela and the ANC had given away too much. So this is the struggle, and in fact we are now fighting for the survival of a liberal constitutionalism in South Africa, and there's not a consensus around it. So, Nelson Mandela, I just love this because I don't know how many of you have visited South Africa and how many of you were in South Africa during the reign of Mandela. So it was a romance. So everybody had a romance with Mandela. It was almost like, the first year or two of Barack Obama's presidency. There was this idea that the world is changing. But Nelson Mandela was a particular kind of human being. And clearly, most of us in this room, and we all know that history is not made by one person. But this one person made it possible for South Africa to go through a particularly difficult period of conflict and violence and take us to another place, at least lay the foundations. And so I think it's quite remarkable, and I always like showing this photo of him. So, the Bill of Rights, the South African Constitution. Let me just say a few things about the South African Constitution. Those of you who are human rights scholars, constitutional law scholars, and so on, know that the South African Constitution is one of the most heralded in the world. It's heralded for several reasons, mostly because of its expansive contribution, its expansive listing of rights, as well as its expansive listing of bodies that will protect human rights, the way that it actually has incorporated both a vertical approach to rights as well as a horizontal approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the South African Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is in many ways a reflection of, as I mentioned earlier, global human rights activism. If you look at the development of the major texts of human rights since the establishment of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Race Discrimination Convention, the Women's Convention, the Refugee Convention, every single important international text is incorporated in South Africa's Bill of Rights, which is both wonderful, but as you see when we come to the Constitutional Court's deliberation, creates all kinds of problems because it promises much, and the obstacles to this promise I'll discuss later. But let me talk a little bit about what the Bill of Rights has done that it's also quite unique and that has not been incorporated in almost any other constitution. Even the Indian constitution promises there are state directives, but all of the rights in the South African Constitution are justiciable. In other words, all of the rights can be taken to court. So the way that we approach human rights is the classic way: civil and political rights, called the first generation rights, the right to vote, freedom of speech, etc., right, freedom of association. Those are seen, and in countries like the United States, Canada, and so on, those rights are paramount. But what South Africa has also done is incorporated social and economic rights, the right of access to housing, the right to education, the right of access to health, the right of access to food, those kinds of things are all incorporated and put on the same plane as civil and political rights. Then a range of rights around physical integrity, violence, and so on, and cultural rights. I'll talk a little bit about how the Constitutional Court has tried to balance the notion of cultural rights in the South African Constitution. Sorry, again. Okay, so again, I promise you this is the last slide I have of Mandela. But the South African Constitution, this expansive constitution, which is so admired and so heralded, obviously is wonderful, but the biggest challenge has been to go out and make it happen. And this is classic. This was when Nelson Mandela, towards the end of his term, recognizing that we had these wonderful rights, but we do not have, we're struggling with the human rights culture. Okay, so as I said, the very, very important thing is the compilation of rights, the listing of rights, and so on. But what is significant about the South African Constitution is that, unlike the situation where you have countries signing treaties which then become law through various processes and so on, the South African Constitution is unique in this way because it mandates courts and other administrative bodies to consider international law in their deliberations. So they must. The Constitution also says that the courts may consider foreign law, but must consider international law. And in fact, the court also says in another part of the Constitution also says in another section that when interpreting any section of the Constitution, it must be within the spirit of international law, and particularly international human rights. So this kind of human rights, global human rights gestalt is very much part of South African constitutional law. And then there are a whole range of other rights in the Constitution. I won't go through all of them. If you wanted to ask questions, maybe during question time. But the reference and the nod to international law, international human rights law, it pervades the Constitution. And in the founding provisions, let me just quickly read to you what the founding provisions provide for, again taken from the major international human rights texts. Human dignity, the achievement of equality and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. So this is what the preamble to the Constitution commits itself to. Non-racialism, non-sexism, supremacy of the Constitution, the rule of law, and so on. The other thing that makes the Constitution quite unique, certainly in comparison to the American Constitution, is that the South African Constitution provides for the negative protection of rights. In other words, the state may not intervene, the state may not. This is very much the major feature of American constitutional interpretation and the American Constitution. But South Africa also, the Constitution regulates relationships between private individuals. In other words, that the Constitution recognizes that much of discrimination and violation of human rights occurs in the private sphere. And so therefore the relationships between citizen and government is regulated, as well as between citizen and citizen. And when you look at the way that the Constitutional Court has tried to ensure that the common law, the law of contract, torts and so on, are infused with constitutional principles, it's a fairly innovative way, and it's an innovative interpretation. But this is all as a way of disrupting the old order and affording and ensuring that human rights is incorporated. And then the other way that the South African Constitution is quite unique, and again compared to many stable democracies like the United States and others, is that the constitutional interpretation in South Africa starts from the premise that South Africa is underpinned by disadvantage, discrimination, and inequalities, and that the job of those who interpret the Constitution must change the status quo. They must absolutely change the status quo. And Carl Clare has referred to South Africa's Constitution as transformative. In the United States, I don't know if any of you look at American constitutional jurisprudence, particularly around equality, affirmative action, and so on. Any derogation from the status quo must be very, very soundly justified. And that's why you have these levels of scrutiny, strict scrutiny for race, intermediate scrutiny for gender, and so on. So that's very an important part of the South African Constitution. There's also, let me see if I got the right one. Okay, I've already spoken about that. Transformative constitutionalism. So there's a lot of literature around critiques of the Constitution. And you know, this new way in which South Africa has approached constitutionalism. Now, Carl Clare is obviously very celebratory of of the South African Constitution, and his article on transformative constitutionalism is probably one of the most cited by constitutional law scholars. And in his article, written fairly early on after the Constitution was drawn up, he kind of talks about the possibilities, the way that the Constitution can really change South African society. Makau Matua is a little more skeptical, and he goes through, he looks at the promises and so on. He looks at this deliberate attempt to create this post-apartheid democratic state, and he warns against some of the pitfalls. Upendra Bakshi and Boa de Sousa Santos have been quite skeptical about all this rights discourse, you know, usurping other ethical discourses. And in their scholarship, they really are much, much more cynical about the possibilities, the transformative possibilities of the Constitution. And then there's a whole literature around feminism and gender equality, and I won't go into it again, maybe with questions. Because we focused during the anti-apartheid struggle so much on racism and eradicating the vestiges of apartheid, people didn't pay a lot of attention to sexism and patriarchy, which Justice L.B. Sachs, who's one of our more well-known justices, Justice Sachs has referred in one of his articles to patriarchy being the only non-racial institution in South Africa. So what has happened is that there's been some very exciting developments, advocacy and literature around South African feminism and so on. And again, we can talk about the limitations of that. Now, there are many, many bodies, constitutionally mandated bodies, to enforce, to implement and interpret the Constitution in addition to the Constitutional Court. There's the Public Protector, and the Public Protector has been very, very busy. If you've been watching the recent deposing of the president, the notions of state capture, corruption, and so on. There's the Human Rights Commission. There's the Commission for Gender Equality, the Electoral Commission, the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities. So there's a range of bodies that have been mandated under Chapter 9 of the Constitution to give effect to the Constitution. Now, before I go on to my next slide, I've spoken for 30 minutes. Now I'm going to take questions, and I'm going to go on to the interpretation of these rights by the Constitutional Court, and then some of the obstacles.
Are there any questions that you would like to ask right now at the moment? Or we should maybe let you speak.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll continue. Yes. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the interpretation of this document. So the Constitution, obviously the post-apartheid Constitution, was a move from a system of not just a sort of an authoritarian racist system, but a system of parliamentary sovereignty, which is the system, the Westminster system, which works well in the UK. Now, you could have arguments about that. It works well in the UK and other democracies. So this shift from a system of parliamentary supremacy to one of constitutional democracy, again, required some serious rethinking. And the courts in South Africa, even though the legal system was, shorn of the substance, technically the courts were working, were functioning. And judges in South Africa during the apartheid years, many judges were admired. And the South African system, the legal system, the court system was one that was functioning. But of course, the constitution could not be placed on top of this apartheid structure. And just to give you one of the limitations, in 1994, in South Africa, there were 200 High Court judges, Supreme Court judges. Only one was a black South African, and only 2 were female. So the entire body of judges in South Africa in 1994 were white males. So you can imagine the nervousness about having this institution of white males interpret the Constitution. So the Constitutional Court was set up. And the Constitutional Court is interesting. It's a kind of, the German model was very much, if you look at the deliberations and so on, the German example was quite an influential one, as well as the Canadian model. But the German Constitutional Court, and to a lesser extent, the Hungarian Constitutional Court served as model. So a new Constitutional Court was set up. And the makeup of that court were mostly people who had a particular ideology in that they were anti-apartheid activists, people, advocates, lawyers, and so on, well respected, but respected as human rights lawyers. So the court was in a good place because the people who were going to interpret the Constitution were really people who were committed to the values of the Constitution. But there was just a problem because there was the superstructure of the courts, and then you put the Constitutional Court at the top. So for some time there was some tension between this hierarchy of courts, particularly the court just below the Constitutional Court, which up until then had been the highest court. And then after a few years, it was decided that the Constitutional Court would be the final court, the final arbiter of all claims, because every claim in South Africa is essentially a constitutional claim. And so that got rid of some of the tensions around hierarchy. So let me sort of talk a little bit about the Constitutional Court cases and just highlight a few where international human rights featured. And then also just to talk a little bit about when the Constitutional Court has chosen to incorporate international law, international human rights law, and when it has chosen actually to forego and discard international human rights law. So a couple of points. Initially, when the Constitutional Court, the first few years, in order to really ensure the credibility of the court and the validity of its judgments, there was great reference to international law, and particularly around the cases in which there was not societal consensus. Increasingly, we see the court refer to international law less and less, and that may just be because it's growing up as a constitutional democracy. But the first case that I want to talk about, which really deals with an issue that is highly contested in South Africa, was the abolition of the death penalty. If you talk to anybody, listen to the talk radio stations in South Africa, because of the crime and a whole range of other things, everybody wants the death penalty to be reinstated. Now, this case, the Makwanyane case, was the first case in which the court really focused on international law. And the history of the death penalty in South Africa, even though the death penalty had been introduced by the British colonialists, it was during the apartheid era that you saw the death penalty being used in a much greater way, and where the death penalty was really a political weapon against apartheid opponents. So the death penalty has a particular place in the history of South Africa, and the court had occasion to consider the abolition of the death penalty, because there had been people sitting on death row during the negotiations, but all the executions were stayed. So this was a fairly urgent matter. And the Constitutional Court did two very interesting things. They went through, the international documents, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and spoke about the right to life, the right to dignity, right to equality, and so on. And came to the conclusion, found that the death penalty, imposition of the death penalty, was unconstitutional, violation of those rights that I just mentioned. But the court also took and spent quite a bit of time looking at popular opinion, because popular opinion in South Africa was in favor of the death penalty. And popular opinion amongst Black South Africans, even though the history of the death penalty in South Africa is highly racialized like it is in the United States, and disproportionately more Black people were executed. In fact, there were very, very few whites under apartheid who were sent to death row. And the court gave a very interesting analysis of the role of an adjudicating body like the court in the face of widespread popular opinion that may not coincide with the constitutional values. And the court, went through a discussion of it and essentially said that the role of the court, the role of the Constitutional Court, is to protect the society from the majority. So a majority opinion popular majority opinion can be deeply, deeply disadvantageous to a minority, and particularly a disempowered minority. So the death penalty was outlawed, and then so this was a case, and it was clear that the Constitutional Court, every judge wrote a judgment, so it's a very long judgment, all referring to international law, all very, very open about international law, principles, human rights, and so on. No issue. They outlaw the death penalty. And in fact, the interesting thing in South Africa is, despite calls ever so often for reimposition of the death penalty, even the politicians have not allowed this, the movement to flourish. But maybe an opportunistic politician who needs to get elected may revive this. Then the questions of equality. Now, most of the equality jurisprudence, if you look particularly again at the United States, I mentioned the United States because that's what I'm most familiar with. This notion of equality is very much about equal treatment. Whereas the South African Constitutional Court has been grappling with this notion of substantive equality, equal outcomes really. So even if people are treated the same, you could get a result that doesn't comport with equality. So they've dealt with quite a few, and the Hugo case is an interesting case because it's one of the cases in which Nelson Mandela as president was taken to court. So let me tell you about the Hugo case. Any of you familiar with the Hugo case in South Africa? It involved the first presidential pardon. Nelson Mandela is elected as president. It's all very good and so on. So he issues a presidential pardon for all women who are in prison who have children under the age of 12. Okay? President, they're all released, pardoned. A male who's sitting in a prison in South Africa who has a daughter under the age of 12 claims that this pardon violates his right to gender equality and that he's discriminated against on the basis of his gender and sex. And he brings a claim to the court. So the court had to consider this notion of equality. And in South Africa, there's a two-pronged test. Again, this is part of this disruptive constitution. In South Africa, there are a few grounds for discrimination: race, ethnicity, gender, national origin, birth, sexual orientation, a range of rights, language, and so on. And if you are a member of that particular designated group, then if you claim discrimination, then the burden shifts to the person who is discriminating to show that it's not discriminatory. Now, in the United States, you have to prove discrimination. So there's a two-pronged test. You have to show, if you're part of a protected group, you have to show discrimination. And the second is the burden shifts to the discriminator, who then has to show that the discrimination is fair, is constitutional. It's fairness. So Nelson Mandela gets hauled into court. So the first thing is the presidential pardon is an exercise of public power. So the constitutional court, it's part of the constitution. It's subject to review. And the judges then go through a very interesting sociological discussion around the role of women in raising children and the contextual realities of South Africa, where the majority of those who are raising children, single-parent households, etc., are women. And so the court goes into a very, very interesting discussion, and the two female judges on the court, their judgments are particularly profound in that they look at this and say, if you take not just a straight legal approach, but you look at society, if you look at the context of South Africa, then the discrimination is fair. And the majority of judges, except for one, who dissents very, very strongly and says that the majority's decision gives license for the reinforcing of stereotypes of women. It's basically the dissenter is saying that when you say women are the major caregivers, you reinforce the idea that women are the major caregivers and so on. Interesting judgment. Now, when I first wrote about that judgment, I was, viva the judges, great judgment, substantive equality and so on. Now, the more I think about it, that judgment has some problems because in a patriarchal society, I think there's some real, issues around stereotyping. If you want the world to change, do you wait until it's changed or do you change the world and so on? So to some extent, in the Makwanyane case, the court was prepared to be a leader. In the Hugo case, the court seems to take South African society as it is, as it was then, and said this is not discriminatory. And then the Bay case, this was again an interesting case because most post-colonial governments in Africa and in other, probably in Asia, probably in South America, but I think particularly in Africa, struggle with this idea of cultural rights versus gender equality. So there are a range of rights. In South Africa, there are a range of indigenous norms. We'll just put aside the European norms, Western norms, and so on. Indigenous norms that discriminate against women. My argument is polygamy, for example, discriminates against women, but polygamy is legal in South Africa. There's a statute that protects women in polygamous marriages. But there's one practice in indigenous law which basically states that a female child cannot inherit it. It's the rule of primogeniture, and so girl children can't inherit. And this was a case coming out of Cape Town in one of the townships where a man who was living with a woman and they had 2 daughters, he died. And the practice is for the next male relative to come and claim the property. And this was taken to the Constitutional Court, that this practice discriminated against women, violated the constitutional right to equality. And the Constitutional Court dealt with this again in a very, very lengthy judgment, looking at the history of this practice and why the practice evolved in rural communities where people lived collectively, collaboratively, and so on, where property was shared, etc., and then looked at urban South Africa in 2008 and basically said, in its judgment, very stridently, that the practice violated the Constitution, violated the principle of gender equality, and therefore it should be abolished. Quite dramatic. There are not many. If you look at many countries, post-independence countries, struggling with this notion of indigenous rights versus, and it's even in sort of countries of the global north, this notion of culture versus, right, the cultural relativism versus universalism debate. That judgment, the Bay judgment, is a wonderful description of how a court can, with integrity and very thoughtfully, deal with these conflicting questions. And then there were cases that sort of, the Constitution requires that all law conform to constitutional principles. In this case, the Carmichael case was a case of a woman who was violently attacked, assaulted by a man who was out on bail, who the police knew was dangerous, and they didn't. She went to the police station to say she feared for her life. The police did nothing. She was violently attacked. She sued the police, and the court held that the common law of tort, the negligence that the police had inflicted on this woman, that it was covered by the Constitution. So there was a way of bringing constitutional human rights norms into the common law. And then there were the cases involving social and economic rights. We can go into that. But I just want to talk a little bit about the Azapo case, because the Azapo case was a clear illustration of where the Constitutional Court considered international law and gave short shrift to international law because it didn't conform to the political realities of South Africa. So the Azapo case was a case to challenge the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, seen as the gold standard, one of the most prominent families in South Africa, basically said that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in violation, violated their constitutional rights as well as their rights under international law because of the amnesty provisions. Perpetrators who disclosed truthfully their activities, whether it was torture, whether it was murder, for political ends, could be granted amnesty by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the claimant said that under international law, all victims have the right to see their perpetrators punished. The perpetrators must be punished for gross violations of human rights. And the international law was very clear about it. But because South Africa was embarking on this process of reconciliation and the political realities were such, the court gave short shrift to international law. So this is just the point that I started out, that the constitutional law, the court and other courts in South Africa, in trying to deal with a globalized, universally sort of the consensus around human rights, is struggling because the South African realities don't always allow for acquiescence in this universal consensus. So what are the obstacles? What are the impediments? So this is just, I don't know if any of you have been to Cape Town, but this is sort of Sea Point and Constantia, beautiful suburb of Cape Town. Now this is Khayelitsha and some crossroads. This is how some people in South Africa live, and this is how many, many more people live. This is the waterfront in Cape Town, beautiful, the iconic mountain and so on. Then this is the reality for. So what are the challenges to the constitutional democracy? And I would say now it's global as well, because the problems of South Africa, to some extent, the problems that impede a shared notion of rights is also a global problem. So the first is poverty and economic inequalities. South Africa, as I said, I showed you the picture, but if you're in South Africa, it's apparent that a small portion of South Africans live a life that lends itself to this global, universal consensus. The large majority of people live in wretched conditions, or far too great a number. I'll come back to corruption, this fragile system of human rights. I would say a fragile culture of human rights. I forget his name, the former Chief Justice of Australia. I remember this, he said this at a conference in the 90s, and I was so outraged at this statement because we were so proud of our South African constitution, or the Australians don't have a Bill of Rights. And he said something to the effect that a country that has a strong culture of human rights does not need a Bill of Rights. And a country that has a Bill of Rights that doesn't have a strong culture of human rights will not. So nowadays nowadays, I actually think that he was right. That if you look at, for example, a country like Australia, Australia also has its human rights problems, but look at rights in Australia, the lived reality of people, the fact that people live some kind of dignified life, maybe not indigenous people, but for the most part. And there's a way in which people feel secure in their homes. So I think that question. So South Africa has a very fragile culture of human rights, and it's not just the violence against women and the crime and so on, the xenophobia, the way that some politicians opportunistically violate human rights and encourage it from others. So I think that internalizing of human rights norms has not happened, and I think it's a challenge for most societies, but particularly for a country like South Africa, where there's been this concerted effort to establish this human rights state. Corruption, because of the fragile culture of human rights. So people do not necessarily understand that they do have rights. And I spend a lot of my time working with students and others in sort of educating people about rights. So we go out to high schools in the townships, and we, try and engage with communities about the rights they have. I mean, the one thing about when I first went to the United States as a graduate student in the mid-1980s, one of the things that I was so struck by, because this was still apartheid South Africa, one of the things that I was so struck by was how American children would talk about their rights. Everybody would speak about their rights. And South Africans, that's just not some people, the elites. But sometimes I'm on the board of a public interest organization, and one of the things we do is run a clinic. And sometimes people come to the clinic, they don't even know they have a legal claim. So that it's incredibly challenging. Then the legal profession. The South African legal profession is fairly formalistic and conservative. It's a legal profession that has produced some of the great lawyers, Sidney Kentridge, for example, and others, Arthur Chaskelson. But the profession as a whole is very, very not resistant. But if one looks at this constitution, which is transformative and really talks about upending everything, the profession, to a large extent, doesn't mirror that. And government has intervened in lots of different ways to try and get the mainstream profession to think more creatively and to really try and push for creative ways to approach the Constitution. So, for example, I became the dean of UCT Law School 2 years ago, and I'd been the dean at a law school in the United States. And when I was quite astounded that some people hadn't really considered that the people we are training to be lawyers are the people who should go and, do what the Constitution said we should do. But it's so formalistic, and maybe that's just the legal profession, I don't know. And then the cultures of masculinities, this is an area that I think that people see this question of gender equality as just an aside, it's sort of something that you talk about everything, and then you talk about gender equality and add on. But gender equality in South Africa it's in the fabric of the society. It is implicated in disempowerment and disadvantage in such a fundamental way. As I said, it's in the DNA, that unless we deal with the cultures of masculinities, we are, again, the constitutional project won't mean much. So I think I'm going to stop there. But just again, just to sort of say that when I started, I spoke about the moment of disruption and creation of this new human rights state and the excitement. And now, 25 years later, that global moment is no longer there. The consensus around global human rights is certainly being frayed. And for me, the question really is whether the sort of disruptions that we thought 25 years ago, what we do about it now, because it hasn't come to fruition. And moving forward, I'm not sure how we think about a human rights culture and we think about transformative possibilities in the face of this changing approach to global human rights norms. So I'll stop there. I'll also tell you a joke about, because we mentioned Australia. Any Australians in the room? You know, there was this big issue last week because a South African cricketer, you know, sort of ruffled an Australian cricketer. And you know, there's just if you're in South Africa, there's real competition between white South Africans and Australians. Go back to, you know, long story. But so I was going to talk at my alumni reunion, and one of my friends who's a keen cricketer, we were going to have some Australian guests at the reunion, and my friend said, I want to tell you an Australian joke, and I need you to tell that joke because the Australians will be there. And this is the joke that he told me, that he said, you know, the world, Gore Vidal said that the French admire all writers. The British admire only good writers. The Americans admire writers whose work is converted into film or TV. And you have to explain to Australians what a writer is. They don't know about it. Anyway, that was the joke he told me. But I'll end there, just on a light note. It's not true about Australia, let me just say that. Any questions, comments?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for fascinating talk. Yes. No, it's more for recording, not for the audience, I think. You said at the beginning that the release of Nelson Mandela was at the same time with the Berlin Wall and collapse of the USSR. I was born in USSR. Yes, and looking at what happened in 25 years in Russia and in some of other post-Soviet states, I can see some similarities, how having good laws, very, you know, in a Human Rights Convention and all other conventions ratified, but having just recently in this weekend, democratically elected president for the next 6 years. So how it coexists with the violations of human rights and with undemocratic regime. But talking about what you said about how this new constitution does not reflect in everyday lives, and especially if you talk about gender. So what else can you add? So yes, it's embedded in culture, but for example, the current structure of social institutes and also current democratic regime, how does it impact on these relations?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make, I agree with you about laws, your earlier point about laws and the lack of democracy, and you use Russia now. I think the difference, the big difference as I see it between South Africa and Russia is that nobody is jailed in South Africa for criticizing the president. I mean, we have a very robust press and institutions. I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure, but I think that that's absent. So I think constitutional framework and robust institutions, that's important. But culture, I'm using culture, I was speaking about indigenous culture, but I think that culture one should use with a capital C. We were just talking about it over lunch, that it's not just about attitudes towards women and you know, the ideas that people have about women, but it's in the economic system. So, for example, if you look at the major institutions, influential institutions in South Africa and elsewhere, if you look at the participation of women, you'll see that there's a lot lacking. There's a lot of literature now about female leadership. and the different approaches. There's this volume that's been done in the States called The Presumption of Incompetence, that women, to a large extent, are presumed incompetent. Not all men think that all women, but the Me Too campaign has highlighted the problem. So I think it is, every society has it, but I think in South Africa, because there's such poverty, there's a lack of education, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. But it's not just in the poor townships in the rural areas. It's in the boardrooms in Johannesburg and Cape Town as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, my question might sound like a question from a layman, because
thank you.
Law,
it's
yeah,
good,
but it's not easy actually. Here is a situation. I'm coming from Iran, from the Middle East, and my understanding is that in that region, it's very easy for some regimes, authoritarian regimes, to set some rules or laws and expect the citizens of the country to follow them, religiously. And the law serves the authoritarian regime, not necessarily the citizens. So here we're looking at a conflict of interest. On the one hand, if those laws are religiously followed by people and of course by the government, what is at the stakes? What will be violated will be freedom of speech, of freedom of thought, freedom of religion. And on the other hand, citizens are expected to follow those rules. So how do we, resolve this conflict? That's one of my questions. And so, do I go on? Or? Okay.
Shall I answer this question?
Okay, sure. Yes.
So the first is, I think that, again, South Africa is not Iran, or it's a country that has rights enshrined in the Constitution, and those rights are there. The conflict in South Africa is not between an authoritarian government and the citizens. It's about the consensus, the Washington consensus, and an economic system that is about, free enterprise, capitalism. There's a big debate about it. Poor South Africans expected that the system, the economic system in place, would benefit them, that there would be some redistribution of land, because land was stolen. And, that there would be ways in which white privilege would somehow be addressed through the economic system. So ours is in fact, ours is the same battle that's happening in other places. I think Brexit is, to me, represents the tensions between sort of liberal international capitalism and so that's our struggle. We don't, in South Africa, the police are, the police are violent. We've had all kinds of violations from the police and stuff, but those can be dealt with. They're patently unlawful. People don't live in fear that the government's going to come, and arrest you because you criticize the government. It's a different kind of...
You're talking about the current government.
Yes.
What about the apartheid government?
Oh, that was the apartheid government, like the Iranian government, sort of.
Okay.
So I think that's it. And I think that, to a large extent, not to minimize what people who live in an authoritarian state have to go through. It's easier through laws and so on to state clearly that the authoritarian state is unlawful and put in place rights, and it is much harder to address economic inequalities and the lack of dignity that most people, certainly on the continent and in South Africa, live by. And I think that's the challenge. It's just a recycled old struggle around capitalism versus communism. It's different names now, and I'm not an economist, but I think that changing the laws to a large extent, it's the easiest implementation of rights. It's how those rights are translated into the way people live and their expectations about the society in which they live.
So changing the laws. We definitely need an agent here who's going to change the law.
Yes.
And the only agent who's capable of doing it is the government itself. And obviously the government is not going to do it because they're not going to put their own benefits in jeopardy. You know, those countries in the Middle East are all oil rich. There's a lot of oil there, actually. So oil is, you know, a kind of a factor that helps the governments to, you know, suppress people. You have money, so you can easily summon, you know, I don't know, you put together an army or put together a suppression group to suppress people easily. How do you think, or is there any possibility that the government will decide to make such a change to the law?
Well, I don't think that the people who benefit from any system are likely to want to change that system. So I think that, I grew up under apartheid, and as a student, university students, the police used to, arrest us and beat us up and so on. We never thought that we would see the end of apartheid. I mean, the South African apartheid state was a vicious state. People died, people were tortured and so on. So we thought it was impossible, and then it was inevitable. Now, again, I think that only people who are subordinated can liberate themselves. Governments the apartheid government came to the table because the chips were falling all around them. But if it wasn't for political struggle inside and outside the country, so I think it's hard. I mean, look what happened in Egypt, huge disappointment. But I guess I have this faith that ultimately that good does triumph over suppression, and that people ultimately will prevail, even if it's centuries. It will happen, and it can only happen from the people from the ground up.
True. So my second question, if you don't mind, my last question actually, is actually closely related to what you just mentioned. I'm glad that you brought it up. You very eloquently and clearly described the dynamics underlying this change from an authoritarian regime in South Africa into a more democratic or free nation. And I have a quantitative mind. I would like to ask if you can summarize this dynamics into like a few major variables, a few major factors, like factor one is this, factor two is this, and assign some weights to them, meaning which one is more important here and which one is less important probably, but still important to be there.
Now, you know the story why people become lawyers, because they're not good at math and physics and science and so on, but the variables. For me, the South African, let me say about South Africa, South African democracy will only have meaning if there's economic democracy. So we have all the political rights in the world in South Africa, but unless the reality that I showed you, unless that changes, it's a highly flawed democracy. And then the second point that I spoke to you about, that people have to take responsibility for their liberation, and even in the most trying times. And I take a succor from the fact that Nelson Mandela went to jail, many like him, 28 years. They sacrificed, the ultimate sacrifice. And again, I'm not in any way, trivializing suffering and hardship, but that's what it takes to change structures and institutions.
So the third one would be a good leader, in other words, it has to be there, so it will motivate people.
Now the third one for me is an educated citizenry, and I don't mean book education, I mean education about rights and struggle. Educated citizenry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, can I have another question then as well, to be equal? You mentioned that when between 1990 and 1992, it was a constitutional workshop.
1994, yes.
In 94
yes.
years in South Africa, and there were some supporters of distributional model and human right model. But what were the chances of those who were most supporters of distributional model, and why did another model overtaken with the influence of the United States, or why, for example, the Nordic approach, which combines human rights and social welfare, didn't take the priority.
I think that after 1989, there was a kind of triumphalism about liberalism and constitutionalism and rule of law. I lived in the States at the time, and the number of rule of law workshops that I knew of, that I participated in Eastern Europe, Africa, and so on. So it was almost impossible for anybody who wanted to revisit models of redistribution to gain traction. I think the moment was the moment of constitutionalism, liberal constitutionalism, was paramount, and so that was why. Timing is everything, and I don't think that, in light of what had happened, the collapse of the Eastern European economies, etc., that the redistribution model was the Washington consensus was there. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Now I don't know what would happen, if we did it next year. I mean, I think that populist politics would not provide the answer either. But
Thank you very much, Wahid and Irina. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Gil Kalai. Thank you very much for joining us. And would you like to, give a comment to our speaker?
Okay, so this was really a very moving lecture, and the end of apartheid was, for people of my generation, one of the highlights of our life. And I wanted, and when I was asked to respond as a mathematician, I didn't know how I am related to the constitution of South Africa. So I have essentially two remarks and a question. So my first remark is sort of a personal remark. My grandmother immigrated to Israel, which was then Palestine, in 1923, and her brother was left in Lithuania with his children, and one of his children, she was in a concentration camp during the war after Lithuania was occupied, and then she married an English soldier and moved to South Africa. And so my second cousins, which we also refer to as cousins because we have small families, live there. And I remember they visited me and brought me my first ever jacket. In any case, the daughter, she was involved in human rights and the constitution negotiation. Her name is Janet Love. Maybe you know her. So she was the little cousin in the family. She was a little bit too little for us to play with, but she did quite well afterwards. So she was considered a terrorist since the 70s to the 90s, and she came back to and I think she's interested in human rights matters since then. The second comment, which I think is obvious to everybody, is that we see some shifts all over the world in the other direction. Even the famous Hungarian Constitutional Court that you mentioned as a role model for South Africa, I think it was hardly damaged in the recent years. And also in my country, in Israel, there is a continuous struggle between civil rights, human rights, the courts. There was we don't have a constitution, but there were certain laws that were made into a constitution by the courts, and there is a continuous struggle on these matters. Also in cases, for example, on the matter of women's rights, and we had also similar cases where on claims or dubious claims for equality, some very small islands of places where women have some special rights due to their role in society, in the family, where there were attempts to be taken. But my last comment, so my last comment, which is a question, it's actually not about human rights, but it's about the criminal law, and this is about this remarkable truth and reconciliation thing and the amnesty for truth that you mentioned. And it looks that this perhaps was a good idea for this matter of human rights violation for apartheid, but even in the criminal law, we struggle with huge amount of crimes, and it's not clear how to, well, you know better than me how the criminal law is doing, but even in the case which was recently by the Me Too movement of the massive attacks, sexual attacks on women, also on men, and which only very small percentage are answered by the criminal law. And then the question is the model of truth and reconciliation and the seeking of truth even without full punishment, is it might be a good model also for the criminal justice?
So I think that there are, in many places in South Africa and elsewhere, there is a movement afoot around restorative justice. So you now see different police departments and different courts looking at the restorative justice model. So, for example, in South Africa after 1998, they established a series of sexual offences courts. And these courts were called, euphemistically, they were called rape courts because it was basically to sort of hold court where there were child victims. And at this point, there were lots of, huge number of cases of children being raped. And they tried this restorative justice model in which the families of the rapist and the families and the way that and the court was not a court in the way that we think of court, with a punitive model. And there are other places where they're also trying to do this. And, for example, the Gacaca courts in Rwanda after the genocide. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, globally, it's loved. It's a gold standard. When you talk to a lot of people in South Africa, the record is mixed, and my fellow South African may also have something to say about this. But I think that people have mixed feelings because of the unfinished business of apartheid. So the people who got amnesty were people who told the truth about their acts. Now, there were some people who got amnesty, for example, I recall, because they filmed the human rights violations hearings. There was this one guy who was a security police officer. And if you saw him in the street, he looked, like you, a nice guy. You wouldn't know that he embodied evil. He had 2 young children. And what was his job? Every day he left his wife and 2 children in the suburb of Cape Town and then went to his office where he tortured people. And he used to talk about what he did and, torture methods and so on. He told the truth. It was for a political purpose, his activity. He was a security police officer and so on. I think it's hard for people to accept that he's got amnesty and, he lives his life. He still lives in a decent home. Then there are people who live in the conditions so I think it's, forgiveness it's easier for Nelson Mandela to forgive than the people who live in Khayelitsha in those conditions. So I think that's the problem in South Africa. It's a good model, but it's a good model, I think, predicated on certain conditions. And lots of people felt that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, didn't do what it was supposed to do. I think it did what it was supposed to do. It was only about looking at those who committed gross violations of human rights. But, there were 22,000 victims of the TRC, 22,000 victims. We have a country with over 40 million people. And if you take intergenerational violence, then the victims are millions. So I think but I do think that the criminal justice system needs to think creatively about non-punitive methods, restorative justice methods, and try and ensure that people who go through the court system or imprisoned, or even find ways of alternatives to imprisonment, have to go back into the society. And you see that in the United States with these huge numbers of black males who are imprisoned, who it's a turnstile. They come in, they go out, and the violence is. So I agree with you. I think that there's creative ways of looking at truth and reconciliation commissions for the criminal justice system, as in some cases a substitute would do very well for many societies.
Gil, thank you very much for your comment. It was exactly our main idea to bring in people from different disciplines to provoke discussion and to let everybody look at specific issue from different perspectives. So once again, thanks to all of you for your comments and questions. And now I would like to open the discussion for everybody from the audience, and we would like to accept questions from fellows. Could you please bring the microphone? Oh, you got it? Okay.
Professor Andrews, thank you very much. That was a tour de force through South African constitutional law, a superlative job. Thank you very much. My question is about the whole issue of rights replacing redistribution. So the apartheid, the struggle movement prior to 1989 was about redistribution as well, to a large extent. And you said that kind of fell by the wayside when the rights discourse started. And I think you also mentioned that there's a lot of frustration in South Africa now about redistribution that didn't happen. So I think there's a lot of frustration, and there's a critical race theorist at my university, for example, that calls for the abolition of the Constitution. Says that it was a compromise, it was an unfair compromise, and it should be scrapped. My perspective is different because Americans are very trivial about their constitution in the sense that scholars don't refer to the constitution as the supreme law of the land. But in almost every court judgment, in every article written about the constitution in South Africa, it's still referred to as the supreme law. Is there any possibility, in your opinion, of establishing redistribution without liberal democracy guaranteed by a constitution? Or is it the constitution that stands in the way of redistribution?
Thank you. Yes, I do. I've actually written in an article just published in which I disagree with your colleague, Mr. Mudiri, because his position is that the Constitution really doesn't provide anything, and that all of us who believe in constitutional values, we're constitutional fundamentalists. And my response is that Patricia Williams is a critical race theorist in the United States. And at one point, critical race theory was very, very prominent in the discourse. And one thing that you mentioned, which I think is so true, when people have been denied their most basic human rights, their dignity, when they've been erased, as Black South Africans have, to say, as she says about African Americans who used to be slaves, to say now you have rights. In other words, you are human. You are worth something. Her words is, that's delicious. It's delicious in the minds and the hearts of former slaves. It's the same in South Africa. Apartheid was erasure. It was non-recognition. So when a young scholar, I attribute it to his youth, because I think that we all, when we're young, sometimes we get things right a little bit later on, but experience does teach you. So the Constitution of South Africa is. The problem is not the Constitution, the problem is its implementation. So when he says get rid of the Constitution, I say, and do what? What's the alternative? Then the other thing is, I'm very polite. We talk about redistribution. It's communism versus capitalism. I mean, I certainly for my generation, that was the struggle. Were you a Marxist or not? If you weren't a Marxist when you were at university, you may as well, have been of the Third Reich. That's how radical student politics were in the late 70s, early 80s. But I think that we all saw what happened with under communism. For people to have rights, individual rights are important, but it's not to the exclusion of other rights. So I think the trick for South Africa, I see the Northern European models, the Norwegian, the Scandinavian model, as something that we ought to seriously consider, because it combines both individual and collective rights. And in South Africa, we need a serious social democracy. So it's not one or the other. And I certainly, people say the Constitution is not worth anything. I say, you haven't taken a look at the Constitution. And it does provide rights, it does provide protections, and you can use it.
Thank you very much. I think that yes, Misha.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So I have a question about one of your comments. You said that discrimination in South Africa, at least in some parts, is at the DNA level. So to what extent it's a scientific statement? So and if this
short
is,
or long answer?
and if this is scientific, I mean, so it's for me it's a physical defect. Then words can't help to change it. So legislation is completely helpless in this situation. So why then to bother about all these laws and the courts? Because it's just a defect. It's like if you have a disease, you can't talk to cure the disease, right? So it should be physical manipulation. Just by talking, well, I'm not sure.
Okay, so you know
But that one is physical, right? It's physical. And another question is related to gender equality. So I think, well, I believe that everyone in this audience sympathizes to this idea. But then sometimes I think people, including sometimes in your talk, you use this factor to basically to judge in a sense. When you said how many females were on this, that or other panel, and how many males, etc. So don't you think that judgment just by gender factor may actually amplify gender inequality sometimes?
Okay, so your first, the DNA, you know that lawyers take license with language. It's the tools that we have. It's not scientific at all. What I'm saying is it's in the DNA. You know, people, it's a default position. And people are accustomed to behaving in particular ways. Now, let me give you a benign example. In South Africa, I take my own family. You know, when we have family gatherings, the men go one side and the women go the other side, and the women are serving the men, and so it's just, you know, I've even stopped arguing about it because, you know, how can. So what I'm saying is there's benign, and then there's just the reality that you cannot live in a society that's so steeped in racism and sexism and think that you switch off the light like that. I mean, in South Africa, when you walked on the streets of Cape Town, and so if you're a black person and a white person's walking on the pavement, you step off the pavement. Blacks used to address whites as boss. You know, that was and if you didn't, people would get into trouble, you know. So you don't change that because you have a constitution. That's what I mean, it's in the DNA. Racial superiority and racial inferiority was what kept South Africa going. It was internalized. That's what I'm talking about. So that's what I mean in the DNA. I'm not saying that every white South African is a racist and every male is a sexist. What I'm saying is that patterns of the habit of institutionalized systems are internalized. And so we need more than the Constitution to change it. So that was my point. I'm using it figuratively, yes. So, yeah. So we are lawyers that aren't always literal, because God help us if we are literal. But the second point about judgment, yes, I am making judgments. I make judgments. I make moral judgments all the time. If we have a problem in South Africa that too many women are raped, then we need to do something. I'm making a judgment about the rapists. And I'm making also a judgment about the culture that allows those rapes to continue and be seen as entitlement on the part of male. So yes, I think that you have to make judgments. That's what the exercise in human rights is. Because we're not all, you know, if people misbehave, we judge them. I'm not good, yeah? Oh, no,
it's
no.
unbalanced if you just literally count the number of females, number of males, and judge just by this factor, because sometimes it happens not because it is biased, right? It just happens in this way.
Yeah,
we can do an experiment. How many South African representatives we have in the audience? I know 2, right? So how many black people from South Africa we have in the audience? From South Africa?
I'm a black South African.
Okay, fine.
there's a white South African, but the 200 judges that I mentioned, it's not that it just didn't just happen. It was institutionalized. You couldn't become a judge in South Africa under apartheid if you were black. And I'm using black in the South African
Well,
way.
that's a different story. That's, of course, if this is,
But that's what I was
bad.
using.
But I mean that sometimes it just the numbers. This is just people compare numbers and say this is already biased. But all I'm saying, it's not necessarily biased if there is some unbalance in numbers.
I take your point, but it depends on the situation.
Yeah, it
The
depends on the
9
situation, and one
situations-
has to account for many more parameters, not just pure numbers.
Okay.
You and I
Maybe
need to
we'll-
have a conversation
Maybe
privately.
we will stop it here and give a chance to some others. Yes, I first of all would like to accept some questions from fellows and then give a floor to mentors, okay? So could you please bring a mic here? Yeah, oh, yes.
So excellent talk. So several hats. So first of all, I deal with behavioral change and changing preferences and habits, but I really try to focus on the certain one individual. I look at behavior and the brain. But definitely what you're describing is an amazing behavior change and habits of a nation. But still, this is just, you said, like it's the laws, constitution, but behavior itself has not yet changed. And I know I have a good friend who lives in South Africa, the problematics of it. So, like, do you think it will change? Will just take time? It will trickle down from. So this is like a bottom up, like the Nelson Mandela and everything. But then now it's the constitution top down. But how will you make it spread to the whole nation?
Well, I think there are many things. But for example, when Nelson Mandela was the leader of the country, he exhorted people to be the best they can be, to forgive. National reconciliation was what he was focused on. And people admired him. And the fact that the world admired and loved him made South Africans want to be like him. In the last 10 years, we've had a president who is a kleptomaniac and a polygamist. I'm making a judgment here, sorry. Okay?
Oh, we're from Israel. We know all about this.
All right. So but the point is, so when people see leaders behaving in that way, then we see, I mean, in South Africa, the crime statistics, just theft. I can't even begin to tell you. Just theft, getting my mobile phone stolen a few weeks ago at a shopping center. And people are like, oh, that's your phone. Everybody gets their mobile phone stolen. So it's a sort of, it takes leadership and it takes cultural change and so on, but that's just one. There are many, many things that go hand in hand. But at the core of it, people have to live dignified lives, which they can feed themselves, their families, send their children to school, those kinds of things.
So my second question, that's an Israeli, is that do you think that, we had a brilliant discussion yesterday by Professor Giri, so it's like, you think it's the individual that made the change, right? Nelson Mandela. So if an Israeli were on the bad side of it, so if the Palestinians do not have their own Nelson Mandela, right, it's a total different story. It's like, how will you need a leader to look up to? So it's stuck. You think it's the one person really in the timing in 9/11, everything. It's like in hindsight, it's 2020. So it's.
I think leadership is just one thing. We were just very lucky in South Africa to have Nelson Mandela. Like the Indians had the Mahatma Gandhi, African Americans had Martin Luther King. They weren't the only. It wasn't the only thing, but it's a key factor. And I've often thought about the Palestinians, thinking that the Palestinians, if they had a Nelson Mandela, maybe, things would be different. I don't know, but that's just one factor. That's just one factor. And how people change, I think it's both individual and institutional. So, for example, people in South Africa now say to me, when the violence against women, it's because of apartheid to dehumanize people, dehumanize men, blah, blah, blah. And I say yes, but it's one individual man making a choice to assault a woman. So it's institutional, but it's also individual. So the two are together, go hand in hand.
Thank you very much. Since we're a little bit limited in time, I would like to accept one question from each. Okay, so please one question. David, we will start with you.
So I just want to comment. I think Patrick can talk, about whether it's an individual or an individual and a tipping point, right? I mean, from your experience and history, right? Um, but you know, the question I have is more technical. I'm really interested in restorative justice. So you know, in the United States, you mentioned a lot the United States. In the United States, we use this approach to address misdemeanors, right? I mean, I don't think we've ever thought about addressing rape cases using this approach. Can you sort of talk a little bit about a restorative justice in the context of the South Africa context, and sort of what is the reason behind adopting this approach for a crime that is very much serious?
I think that one of the things that's happened there have been institutions, I know in New York, sort of non-government institutions who work with ex-offenders. And what they do is, this is not government, but it's non-governmental. They bring the offenders together with their victims. That's a restorative justice approach. And I think it makes a difference when the offender, the perpetrator, actually confronts the consequences of his or her crime on the victim. So I think it does work. Other ways is, I knew people in New York, there were a group of, it was a sort of German-Jewish dialogue where people would talk across. In South Africa, you know, there's sort of black and white dialogue to talk through. And these are all restorative justice methods. But it's you know, there's this African saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So what you do is, these things require small as well as large gestures to make it happen. So it's not just one big thing. It's little sites, little venues where a restorative justice approach is adopted. And it's got to be both internalized individually as well as seen as the larger good. I think the South African Truth and Reconciliation, on balance, was a good thing. It was unfinished business, but a good thing, because we couldn't go from apartheid to democracy without that bridge. And therefore, I think that it has, you know, to be able to forgive, I think is societally and individually is probably more beneficial than wanting to punish, both for the perpetrator and the victim. But you know, I was raised by Catholic nuns. So there may be others who have a different approach and can logically argue why the opposite is true.
If I may ask, it follows in some ways from this. You say, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Is the constitutional, or and the Constitution itself and the reconciliation program simply a few bites eating the elephant? Now, you say not to abolish the Constitution, but if I don't know much about South Africa, but I gather that Section 25 is about to be abolished, which will allow expropriation of land without compensation. So a fundamental part of what made possible this transition is going to be abolished from the Constitution. In Latin America, we have seen amnesty given to people who committed crimes against humanity, then being lifted later on in a more stable situation, and people prosecuted. Can we expect that your man who got up in the morning, kissed his wife goodbye, and went off and tortured, one day will be thrown into prison after the transition, after 25 years, is now solidified? It's now safe to go after the white landowners, to go after these other people, and eventually to destroy landowning, as was done in Zimbabwe, and eliminate white landowners, and then also punish those who were the most involved in apartheid if they're still alive.
Okay, so I'm not a betting person, but I'm going to bet that Section 25 is not going to be abolished. And in fact, everybody now, many advocates, human rights advocates, are really pushing hard against this wholesale expropriation without compensation. Everybody in South Africa, including the president, knows that the Zimbabwean model was a disaster. And the president has in Parliament just last Friday said, absolutely, this is not smash and grab. The problem is not Section 25. The problem is, and I've written about it and others, the government has failed to do what Section 25 mandates it to do. it can expropriate. It can find ways to redress and address the land problem. It just hasn't. So what you're seeing is opportunism because the government election is coming up next year. But I do believe that there's sufficient, that we have a sufficiently robust human rights organizations, media, and people, both black and white, who know that wholesale smash and grab, like they did in Zimbabwe, will destroy South Africa. And it's not going to happen. I doubt it. I doubt it very, very much. But I think there's a lot of noise around it, which I think is good, because now everybody knows about Section 25. So now people are starting to talk. What did the government do? What didn't they do? And it is very, very clear that the government hasn't even begun to address this issue. But what people also don't hear is the fact in the Western Cape where I live, wine farms, former slaves of, the Cape was the Dutch brought slaves to the Cape. People went to work on the wineries, and so now you have farmers in partnership with workers, cooperatives, these wineries, and the wine industry is very, very profitable in South Africa. It's good. And so there are these shared arrangements. The farmers themselves, farmers have taken it up themselves. We don't hear about that. If you go to Mpumalanga and Limpopo, the northern provinces that border Botswana and Zimbabwe, all those wonderful safaris that people go on about, the people who got land, they're working with safari companies, wilderness companies to partner to make those places profitable. So it's happening, but the noise is only about now the government has said we're going to expropriate without compensation. It's one of the things that the government will do, and under the current constitution, they can do that. But this is a lot of political noise to ensure that the ANC looks as radical as the EFF, the opposition party, and hopefully can, sort of get younger people to vote for them. The question, I think, which is the one that you point out that I think is of concern, that I don't know, I'll bet on it. What if they've poked the bear? What if there's a whole group of people, because we have youth unemployment is at close to 50% in some places. What if those people think that the only way that we can address this problem is through land grabs? And I don't have the answer to that. But right now where I'm sitting, I don't think government will, and not this president, who's a farmer. I don't think it's going to happen. But they will start seriously addressing the problem now because they've made some promises and they'll have to deliver.
Okay, I can see that we have now less than 10 minutes before we need to break for a coffee break, but I would like to, Nkatha, please, and then Catherine, and then we will give, the word to Professor Spew.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay,
I very much enjoyed it. In fact, listening to you, save for the Nelson Mandela part and the apartheid story, this is the story of Kenya. It is the story of the constitution-making process in Kenya. It's also the story of the kind of Bill of Rights we have. It's also the story of the incorporation of international law. In fact, we have a section that talks about the whole body of international law being part of the sources of law in Kenya. So there's so many mirrors, and so my question really is also a question that I ask of what is going on in Kenya, which is, why is the law in the books so different from the law in action? And does it have something to do with the fact that the language of production of the Constitution, which means the constitution-making process, the going around the country, asking people for their views, finding out what they wanted in the Constitution, having all these consultations with international organizations, different countries, the casserole that you talk about, does that process, the language of production of the Constitution, and the difference between the language of production of the Constitution and the language of distribution, could that be the reason why the law in the books is so different from the law in action?
I think that there was a large process of consultation from the bottom up. I think it's not that the law in the books is different. I think that people have not taken advantage of the law in the books. So it's more the laws are missing in action. It's not that the laws on the books are different. It's just people have rights. And when they go to the courts and exercise those rights, some of our class action, for example, the treatment action campaign, As you know, the president, this current, Jacob Zuma was the president who'd just been deposed, but before him, Thabo Mbeki was the president, and he was an AIDS denialist. He refused to see the causal connection between HIV and AIDS. And consequently, many, many people, hundreds of thousands, died. Some people argue millions. But the Treatment Action Campaign was a very, very vibrant civil society organization that forced the government, going to the courts, to distribute antiretrovirals to HIV-positive pregnant women. That was an example of where the people exercise their rights and so on, and there are others as well. So it's not about the law being different, it's about the law not being implemented. But you were right, Kenya's story, it's a post-colonial African story.
Thank you for the talk. My question has to do with something you touched very briefly on, the fact that the younger generation doesn't accept the constitution as it is, or did I misunderstand?
No, there's a trope by some young academics and some young activists who say that the constitution has no value, it has no meaning, and that it should be scrapped. They don't provide an alternative, you know, there's a lecturer at the University of Pretoria, for example, who writes about this. It's not a majority view, but I think it's about disillusionment. It's about disillusionment and disenchantment. And the trick is for those of us who believe in constitutional values and so on, to ensure that what the Constitution promises, we are working towards them, those promises being delivered to all South Africans, not just a few.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned very quickly the role of education, which I think is crucial for the future. Education might be a tool to restore the culture of human rights. So could you comment more on that? And more specifically, maybe this is a place, education, where the international community could help through UNESCO, for instance. UNESCO is a global organization to help for education all over the world and to implement the culture of human rights. So could you comment on that?
Whether UNESCO can help South Africa? Is that the question? Or?
Yes, maybe. But first, are there actions on education in order to implement the culture of human rights in South Africa? First, at home. And second, could UNESCO help to do that?
You know, South Africa has a very vibrant civil society around education. The education system, it's a long story, but, you know, huge gaps, problems. There's one particularly prominent NGO, the Equal Education Center, that does a lot of advocacy, education, etc. So there is, I think UNESCO is probably involved in South Africa. So there's lots of organizations working with civil society. So I think that, you know, South Africa can learn from other places and can share lessons from elsewhere.
And do you bet on education to change a little bit?
I think education always. I mean, I think that, and I'm using education with a small e.
Yes.
It's the capacity, people have the capacity to understand and advocate and engage with others who either differ from them in, you know, means or, and so on. So that's how I use education. Ideally, formal education, because that makes you, you know, competitive in the workplace and so on. But education in terms of understanding what rights you're entitled to and what rights others are entitled to. But you know, my fellow South African, you had your hand. I'm saying that you had your hand up for some time. It's okay.
Yeah, because we will today, in the evening, yes, tonight we will have a lot of time for discussion. And I know that, yes, Professor Eliezer, he wants to ask a question, and this probably will be the last question for this session. We will close it up after that.
Okay, in the general theme of our meeting, there are many places on this planet where in the past and also in the future, abuses will have to be settled one way or another. And South Africa somehow stands out, at least from outside, as a relatively bloodless transition of power inside the society. And my question is related to the argument we had yesterday with Patrick. Is this a situation where you believe each case is special, Or are there some general lessons that one can learn how to make such transitions bloodless and in that way less threatening to the parties involved?
I think South Africa is both general and special. It's general because the kinds of struggles that South Africa were involved in and continues to be involved in are global struggles. There are places around the world where this is mirrored, unequal access to resources, poverty, all those problems. It's special in that there was a time when the whole world was focused on the eradication of apartheid. And when Nelson Mandela became the world's political prisoner, it's special because of Nelson Mandela and because of the bloodless transition to democracy. It was, though, if you dig a little deeper, it wasn't as bloodless as some people think. Yeah. But South Africa South Africa, if we in the country get the things right that we should get right, it will probably be the only country in Africa where there's been a sustained growth of democracy post-independence. Most African countries, except for one or two, post-independence went into a decline and now on the way up. But South Africa has had problems, and it's not been easy. But the trajectory is still upward, and you go to South Africa and you look at what South Africa was 25 years ago. So I think that's the key. So yes, it's both special, unique, but also general. And the lessons are really about the lessons of Nelson Mandela had a movement inside and outside the country, a deep political movement. South Africans are incredibly politicized and feel strongly about things. So I think that that's also, people have to feel that they are agents of change. And I think that's a general thing, not just a South African thing.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrews. It might have been very difficult for you since you just arrived this morning, so I really appreciate you for being here and for joining this session and for your beautiful speech and for this active discussion and your answers. I would like also to thank our panelists, two fellows and Professor Kalai, for your participation and the whole audience. Now we will close the session here and we will have 15 minutes break. So please come back by 4:15. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very thankful to the organizing for giving me this opportunity, especially to Eliezer Rabinovich, who is my friend for the last 35 years. And he's quite an amazing person. So if you want to change the world, I don't recommend it, or this not recommending, but if you want to change the world, you should take a role model from Eliezer, and maybe I will elaborate on it in the evening. Okay, so I want to talk about quantum computers, and I promise that this talk will be non-technical, and it will contain less mathematics than the talk by Patrick Gary yesterday. So absolutely not much mathematics, and this is and before I come to the talk, I give you something to think about as an alternative to the talk, to listening to the talk, and this is what was Lord Kelvin's mistake in dating the Earth. You can see here a picture of Lord Kelvin, one of the most important physicists of all time, and certainly of his time, and he was dating both the Earth and the Sun. In estimating the age of the Earth, he estimated the age of the Earth as about 100 million years. And the question is, what was his mistake? And think about it, and I'll tell you in the evening. Okay, and the story I'm going to tell you is about the tension we have in mathematics, in science, between two ideas. One of them is the wish for better and shorter computations, and the other one is understanding our limitation, whether they are fundamental limitations or technical limitations. And both of these ideas are extremely important in the history of mathematics and in the history of science as a whole. And here you see several people that I will not mention all of them, but for example, this guy is Galois, and he discovered, along with other people, that the attempts to find the solutions by radicals to equations that people tried for centuries cannot succeed for degrees above 4. And this guy is Fourier, who found amazing ideas about computing and about functions that really change the world. Many of the other people are related to computers and to the amazing discovery both of computers and of the limitation of computers. Do you know who they are? This is Ada Lovelace. She is one of the pioneers of the age of computers. And this is a very famous scientist who, what? No, this is a famous scientist who was famous for not her science work. This is Florence Nightingale. So she, among other things, she was one of the pioneers of statistics, but and also of nursing. Anyway, so quantum computers are hypothetical devices based on quantum physics, which would enable us to perform certain computations hundreds of orders of magnitude faster than digital computer. This feature is coined quantum supremacy. And the famous example is Peter Shor's quantum algorithm for integer factoring. So to factor a number like 15 to 3 times 5, this is a notoriously difficult problem for ordinary computers, and this is something that quantum computers can do very quickly. And the fact that it's such an improvement for a limited class of problems is quite amazing. Often people say that with a quantum computer, they can solve in few minutes problems that ordinary computer, it will take much more than the age of the entire universe. And the phenomenon of quantum supremacy might be seen by various experiments in the very near future. So although the full-scale quantum computers may wait a little, people are very hopeful to demonstrate quantum supremacy in the next year, even they were hopeful also in the previous year. And this will already prove me wrong. Or my main thesis is wrong. So, but the question we want to deal is, are quantum computers feasible? Is quantum supremacy a real phenomenon? And these are important, clear-cut scientific questions. And these questions are lying in between computer science, mathematics, and primarily physics. And I want to say to all of you, please don't hesitate to interrupt me with questions, with something that are not clear. This will be, I will tell you a story, so I will not get to all the details, but so here is Feynman's view. He was a major pioneer of quantum computer, and he said, nature isn't classical, damn it. And if you want to make a simulation of nature, you better make it quantum mechanical. And by golly, it's a wonderful problem because it doesn't look so easy. And he wrote a very influential paper in 1982 about the possibility of quantum computer. It was largely ignored for about a decade until the discovery of quantum algorithms for factoring and other related development, and then the subject took off very quickly. So I want to tell you, before I tell you about quantum computation, what is computation? And the understanding of what is computation is one of the important insights of mathematics in the 20th century. And I want to describe you a model of computation, which is very, very simple. And a basic memory component in a computer is a bit. And a bit can have two states, 0 and 1. So a bit can have two states, 0 and 1. And then a computer or a circuit is a machine that has n bits, and it can apply certain operation on these bits. And it turns out that for all the computation you see in your computers and see in nature, at least as far as we know, you need only two gates, two operations. One operation is called NOT. And the NOT operation is very simple. You put input 0, it gives you 1. You put input 1, it gives you 0. The other operation is called AND. It's a little bit more complicated because it acts on 2 bits. And if these 2 bits are both 1, then the output is 1. And otherwise, the output is 0. So these are the 2 gates. And with these 2 gates, you can describe all the computation in the world. This insight is called the Church-Turing thesis. So both Church and Turing proposed models of computation in the 30s, around the same time. It was not precisely this model. In fact, they proposed 2 different models, but the thesis, at least in initial formulation, says that this model captures all the notion of computation. So nobody can come up with essentially different model of computation. And then fairly early on in history, it was enlarged to say something also about the physical world. And it says about the physical world that every computation in the physical world can be described by the Church by this model, very simple model of bits that I talked about earlier. Yes? Let me, any computation, anything that you can point at.
I mean, you're describing a system which is based on a countable bits. We often use uncountable real numbers, complex numbers.
Right, so yeah, so this is a good technical point, and still I think that the thesis is that any computation that can be carried out essentially can be described in this model. Even if you use continuous variables, then essentially you can discretize and use it, describe it in this model. In any case, this is a thesis. It's not a proven theorem, and it was extended to physical models. Some physicists challenge it, and most famously Roger Penrose claimed that in our mind we can compute what is called uncomputable functions, but this is regarded as highly unplausible position. But I agree with you that what I said so far, it's a fairly vague statement. It's not a mathematical statement, it's a vague statement about computation to start with, and then when it was enlarged about the physical world and computation. And people from time to time try to find a way around it. Now I want to introduce you to another major ideas of the 20th century, and this is some development which occurred in the 70s, and this is the idea of efficient computation. So then people realized that the computers we have, they cannot compute any function that can be described by this model. They can only compute functions that can be computed efficiently. And the convention about the notion of efficient is that the number of steps is at most a polynomial, say, function of the input. So if the input is million, then it can be million to the second power, but not 2 to the million. So this is an asymptotic notion, which is a very major notion in the theory of computation, and this is the basis for the theory of computational complexity. And here you can see briefly some computational classes. So the theory of computational complexity study different computational classes. The class that we regard as realistic is this yellow circle, which is called P polynomial. Then there are famously classes which are considered intractable, and the most famous is NP that contain intractable problems. And there is a famous problem in mathematics, which is the NP not equal to P problem that I will not describe. And in any case, what our computers can do in very rough terms is inside this P yellow circle, or at least so we thought for a while. And I will not go to this. And then there is a strong form of the Church-Turing thesis which says that every computation in nature is expressed by polynomial time computation. So every computation in nature is represented by a circuit or a computer that belongs to this little yellow circle. And this form of the Church-Turing thesis is challenged by the new, still theoretical quantum computers.
So what do you mean by, what do you mean by a computation in nature?
So I think perhaps the most immediate meaning that if you build a device and this device computes some well-defined algorithmic task, then this algorithmic task belongs to this yellow circle. This is the efficient Church-Turing thesis. So this is the meaning of computation. You build...
It's a statement about Turing machines.
What?
It's a statement about Turing machines, not about nature.
No. You as a physicist, you go home, you build in your yard a device, any device based on any physics you want.
Here's a device. Is it computing?
Well, if you tell me a well-defined algorithm that's computing, then which probably it is, then the thesis says that this well-defined algorithmic problem can be described by an algorithm in P. This was the thesis, and this thesis was challenged by quantum computers, and there's still a weaker form of the thesis. One weaker form of the thesis is that David's computer, this is water, this computer cannot compute NP-complete problems. Maybe you challenge this too, but you cannot use this. Actually, I know some guy in Yale who made the best simulation of water, which is available. And I met, so it was a senior guy and a graduate student, and Peter Marconi, I think, and every time for a while, every time I drank water, I thought about this guy. But in any case, the question of simulating water is an extremely important question. So
simulation is a computation.
Simulation is a computation of some sort.
Simulation is a computation, but the physical system itself often can find, if you want, let's say, for example, find its ground state, which, when represented in terms of, a discrete model, which is, we only believe is already an approximation. There's nothing wrong with the continuum. There's nothing wrong with non-countable sets. Finds its own ground state, evidently. Somehow it does. Analog computation can do better, if you want that.
This is an excellent point. So the effective Church-Turing thesis would say that any process to find the ground states in nature can be achieved by a digital computer, and the modified one with quantum computer would say, okay, maybe you need a quantum computer. But this is a good point. We'll come back to this point. Okay, so now this is the effective ground. And then let me offer you another very basic principle about computation and nature. If you have a computing device, like this bottle of water, and if you can analyze the computing power of this device, and you discover that it's very primitive computationally, then you cannot use this primitive device to compute a superior type of computation. So this is some a principle that I offer to you, and indeed it's not as trivial as it sounds, because when we talk about computational power, we often talk about asymptotic statements. And okay, we look at things in the asymptotic lane, but then we try to implement it for small systems. So there are some issues here. But again, I want you to remember. And here we come to David's suggestion. Maybe we can use physics to move directly from an algorithm problem to a solution. So maybe you give me a problem, I don't know, traveling salesman problem you may have heard, and I will look at my some physicist and ask him to build a device that immediately will go from the question to the answer. And there is a specific suggestion that David suggests. Maybe we will build a system where the ground state, where reaching the ground state will solve a very difficult computational problem. So then we will let nature solve the problem for us. Can this be done? So the answer, so what do you think? This can be done? So maybe it can be done. Actually, many people meditate about it or fantasize about it. There are some problems with this. And the problem is that if reaching the ground state or the minimum energy state represent an intractable computing problem, then your physical device will not will not solve this problem. This is the general wisdom. And maybe there is a clash of intuition between the physical intuition and the computational science or theory of computing intuition, but so far the theory of computing intuition on this problem always win, and it's also agreed to win. We don't expect that we will be able, this will make all this quantum computer very trivial. We will just build a machine that will solve our problem for us. We don't expect that this can do. And
that's what people are doing.
No, they don't okay, so people cannot solve intractable problems using physical device. And I think one reason that this cannot be done is because physical system obey both classical and quantum obey some principle of locality. So for every small time, something happened very locally. And then when you take this local process, you can still simulate it on some sort of a computer. Well, if it's a classic system on a classic computer, if it's a quantum system, maybe a quantum computer. And then the number of steps that comes into the model affect the question if this hypothetical device can work or not. So this idea, which is a very nice idea, to reach ground state in one shot, build some analog machine, does not work. I don't say it has no value as a heuristic idea, but it doesn't give us the miracle to solve intractable problems, unfortunately. Now here is another miracle, and this is the miracle of quantum computers. And the quantum computers, and before I talk about quantum computers, I want to mention that classical circuits, classical computer, if you add to them randomness, random bits, this add, at least on the heuristic level, something to the computational power. Of course, you can implement it by completely ordinary computers, by pseudo-random generators, but the idea of randomness in computation, it's a very crucial idea, it's a very counterintuitive idea. When people raise this idea, people object to it strongly, and still theoretical computer science and the theory of computation, the idea that randomness can help is very, very important. And I should say randomness can help in other areas. In game theory, randomness, of course, is very crucial. Economics, perhaps. Maybe in law, maybe it's not a bad idea to allocate goods by random allocations. So, okay, we can think about it. But in any case, randomness is a great thing. And once you realize that randomness is a great thing in computation, you realize that we have some bizarre theory of probability, which is more general than classic probability. And this is the notion of probability which comes from quantum mechanics. And now I want to tell you what is a qubit. So now that we know that a bit can have values 0 and 1, a qubit is quantum. So quantum computers allow the creation of probability distributions that are well beyond the reach of classical computers. And a qubit is a piece of quantum memory, and the state of a qubit can be you know what it can be? It can be a unit vector in a two-dimensional Hilbert space over the complex number. Now, I'm sure that for most of you this doesn't make a lot of sense, and you can forget it immediately. I will just demonstrate it. First of all, it's not so important, it's complex. I should say, when my daughter was in high school, one day she came home and said, Daddy, what did you do? I said, what do you mean? Why? I didn't do anything. No, what you mathematician do? So I said, what did you do? He said, you invented the whole new types of numbers, so that we'll have more problem. And I said, what number? It turns out this was the complex number. And I had to defend myself to say this happened before my time. She thought this was an unethical behavior, that we invent more numbers just that people will have more problems. In any case, here you can use complex numbers, and this is the right thing to do. But as far as so a probabilistic bit, we can think about this probability distribution. It is 0 with probability P and 1 with probability Q, and P and Q are non-negative and sum to 1. And the Q bit, you can think about it A times 0 plus B times 1, and if A and B are real, they can be even negative, but the sum of their square is 1. So this is some sort of gadget, and it turns out that this gadget, and you can also use complex numbers, give you something which can be realized physically and lead to a new model of computation, not on the level of the original Turing thesis, but if you're talking about effective computing, it gives you something more. And the quantum computer is a circuit which is built from n qubits, n of these guys. So listen to me, don't look what's written there. You have n qubits, you have n of these guys, and at every step you can do something. You can do something either to 1 qubit or to 2 qubits. And you do some operations. These operations are called unitary operations, but it doesn't matter. So you do something which is very similar to the AND and OR. And when I say you can do, IBM already is doing it and offer it to the public. They have a quantum computer with maybe 8 types of gates, and you can play with it. You can run your program on 5 qubits, and they may scale it to 17 qubits. And the amazing thing is that quantum computers can efficiently solve problems that classical computers cannot solve. And they give immense, for specific type of problem, immense progress. Again, problems that will take the whole time of the universe to solve for classical problem, quantum computers can solve in few minutes. Yes?
Can you give an example? I'm trying to figure out what's
Well, one example is factoring integers, but there are some other examples. There are some other examples which have to do with finding distribution. There are examples we have to do with computing Fourier transform. So quantum computers are very good in computing certain Fourier transform. Fourier transform for some functions. So it's technical Fourier transform. So there is some sort of transform that is very useful in mathematics, in physics, and they can do it. But this will be getting too technical. They can do various things, but not everything. It's important to remember. Now, once you run this computer, you apply your gates, you need to do some extra operation, which is called measurement, and after this measurement, you will get a probability distribution on 0, 1 vectors. And these distributions represent probability distribution that a classic computer apparently cannot achieve. And the experiment that Google is trying to do is the following. They try to do experiment of the following kind. They will run a quantum computer with 50 qubits. They will run a random rounds of gates, and then the outcome, they will measure it. This will give them some probability distribution. And this probability distribution will be, they can demonstrate, or they hope to demonstrate, that for a computer, so for a classical computer to which this distribution, it will take, say, years of CPU time. So 50 is about the break-even case. And then they want to scale it to 72 qubits, which they already announced, and this will be something that classical computers will never be able to do. So this is quite impressive. And And once again, you see, from the theoretical point of view, the quantum algorithm, although they don't contain the so-called NP-complete, NP represent non-deterministic polynomial time, they expand much further in the hierarchy of computational classes. So it's really quite an amazing thing. And here, there are near-term plans for quantum supremacy, not only Google, also IBM, Intel, and Alibaba. They are all building quantum computers based on what's called superconducting qubits. There are some companies who build quantum computers based on another technology. And there is a Microsoft that goes its own way and try to build very stable qubits based on another physical idea, which is called anyons, but let me... When? It depends what you mean the first quantum computer, but if you want something that demonstrates... Okay, so no, right, but to do the integer factoring, it will probably take, even from the optimistic point of view, few years, but to do calculation the classic computer cannot do, the plan was to do it by the end of 2017, which made me a little bit nervous because I wrote a paper which was with deadline, this deadline which said that this is impossible. This is slightly delayed, but I think maybe by the end of 2018 they hope to do it. So, I don't know. Yeah, but this is the plan.
It's not a computation, it's a demonstration.
So, yeah, but it's a demonstration of an explicit computation. You get a problem, you get the outcome is a specific outcome, and you can prove that, you can demonstrate this is the correct outcome by running a classical computer for maybe 100 CPU time, and you can prove that the answer is close enough to the answer. Here's what Frank Wilczek, so David's student, have to say about quantum computer. And he said that a quantum mind could experience a superposition of mutually contradictory states. Such mind could revisit the past at will and could be equipped with superposed past and present. So we can find some combination of past and present. To me, a more inspiring prospect than factoring large numbers. So people regard factoring large numbers, they are a bit blasé about it. Okay, you know, we will improve by 500 order of magnitude, but you know, it's only factoring. But here we can actually combine, superpose the minds of two people. This is even more exciting. Leonid Levin on the one that said quantum computers are the sort that factor long numbers seems firmly rooted in science fiction. My friend Avi Virdon said the existence of a quantum computer is entirely consistent with the theory of quantum mechanics. Well, perhaps the theory is wrong. Perhaps quantum mechanics needs a revision to handle a very large number. And he go on, this is in a new book, Mathematical Computation. He go on to speculate about some possible revision. This is a fascinating state of affairs, and it seems that regardless of the outcome, we'll understand more. Okay, so let me show you he thinks about. I think you should read in his book. I'm not a great fan of the idea of revision of quantum mechanics, but you know, you can think that maybe with 500 qubits. So we can think about several options. One option is that really we can do hundreds of order of magnitude improvements of computing time for certain tasks and other related miracles. This is option number one. Option two is revisions of quantum mechanics. And I should say both these options look to me highly implausible. Option number C, which I try to promote, is an argument against quantum computers within the framework of quantum mechanics. And there is also option number D, which says that, you know, maybe quantum computational supremacy is a real phenomenon, but in practice we'll never be able to work it. This is not so satisfactory, especially if people are trying to demonstrate it in the next few months. But I should say that as a mathematician, or as applied mathematician, I want to know the modeling principle for the difficulty or the impossibility of quantum computers. And I don't care, well, maybe I care, but it doesn't matter from the mathematical point of view if this is an engineering obstacle, if this is a fundamental physics obstacle, or anything in the wide spectrum in between. In any case, this is, I can you see, as you can see, this is not a fair choice where I marked my selected answer, but I should say that most people would, the common wisdom and the general view is that quantum computers are possible and that they will be demonstrated soon. Okay, now I want to explain what is the major obstacle for quantum computation. And actually, this was the end of the previous talk about the constitution in South Africa, and it's important in many senses. This is about noise. So noise is a jargon also for errors. So things do not go precisely as we wished them. And the main concern from the start regarding the feasibility of quantum computers was that quantum systems are inherently noisy. We cannot accurately control them, and we cannot accurately describe them. To overcome this difficulty, a theory of quantum fault tolerance based on quantum error correction was developed. So there is a strong and serious criticism of the idea of quantum computers since the mid-90s, which is based on the fact, at least empirical fact, that quantum systems are noisy, and there is a very serious and important development trying to deal with the noise. Of course, some people would say, you know, noise is a technical matter, it's not fundamental physics, we don't care. It should work, and we don't care about the noise. This is not the correct scientific approach, because dealing with noise was certainly the deepest and most interesting aspect of the research in quantum computation, with a lot of importance also to other areas of physics. So, but here, certainly, it's the question, what is noise, is important. And I should say that for quantum systems, every interaction of the system with the outside world amounts for noise. So every time, if you have a system, if the system interacts with the outside world, this is noise. This means that the evolution of the system is interrupted.
So computer connected to the internet, that's a noise?
Yeah. But you know, once you will have the computer, you will have some safe interface with a classical computer, and it can be connected to the internet. So the rest of the world. That's really an excellent question. You know, the technical term for the outside world is the environment. And it's an excellent question what the environment means. Because, for example, when we model one electron, the environment is not everything which is geometrically outside, but also all the degrees of freedom inside the electron that we neglect. So essentially, we have many degrees of freedom which needed to define the system, as David said, maybe uncountably many, maybe continuously many, and we can only handle a few of them, and by neglecting the others, this immediately amounts to noise. And we want to understand what is this noise, and can we... And then here there are two scenarios. The optimistic scenario, which is quite accepted, is that the effort required to obtain a bounded error level for universal quantum circuits increases moderately with the number of qubits. It's therefore possible to realize universal quantum circuits with a small bounded error level regardless of the number of qubits. Thus, a large-scale fault-tolerant quantum computers are possible. This is the common view. This view says that we do need quantum error correction, we do need this machinery, but we will be able to achieve it. There is even a more radical view which says, in principle, we must be able to achieve it. And this is the picture. There is the classical computing, which is a real phenomenon, and which we can achieve from noisy quantum system. And with more effort, we can build bridges. The bridges are either quantum error correction or anions, and this will give us the quantum computer. So this is a picture by my daughter. Right, so, okay, so anions is another way to implement the error correction. So, not the anions, the anionic qubits. So, you can think about it, in our computer, the bit itself implements some error correction. And in some sense, anionic qubits are modeled after this idea, but they also involves a lot of other things. But I agree with you. One of my main points is that there is no real difference between quantum error correction and between anionic qubits. And the difficulties are shared by both of them. And
you should remind the audience that classical computers needed a theory developed by Shen and others of error correction.
Right.
Any computation requires control of errors, and quantum is because of no cloning, complicated. But
this is an excellent point, and I should say my skeptical approach to quantum computer does not extend to classical computer. I do believe that classical computation is possible, but it is a crucial question. What is the big difference between classical computers and quantum computers? And this reminds me about the story of the black cow and white cow. So let me tell you the story about the black cow and white cow. A guy came to visit his friends in the farm, and he asked him, and the friend tell him, you know, you see this black cow, it's a wonderful cow, it gives me 500 gallons of milk every day. And the friend is very impressed and said, what about the white cow? And he said, also. And he said, you see this black cow, it doesn't eat anything. It needs little grass every day. And the friend say, okay, and what about the white cow? And say, also. And it's go for on, so on. And then the friend asked him, hey, you should explain why you are always telling me all these miracles about the black cow. The white cow seems to be as wonderful as the other cow. And the friend says, you know, the black cow is mine. So he said, and what about the white cow? And say, also. Okay, so indeed, the main very major difficulty was to pinpoint a difference between classical computers and quantum computers. I just told the jokes. Yeah, I'm sorry you missed this joke. But anyway, so this is and again in the optimistic scenario, this is the crucial theorem, which says if we have error rate which is small enough, noisy quantum circuits allow universal quantum computing. And the pessimistic theory says, which is my position, the effort required to obtain a bounded error level for any implementation of universal quantum computer increase exponentially with the number of qubits. And this difficulty will be demonstrated for small quantum systems with a handful of qubits. Thus, quantum computers are not possible. Of course, we need an argument for this position, but this is the scenario, the negative scenario, and this scenario can be described in this picture. We have here the basic quantum noisy world, and the basic operations are described by what's called low-degree polynomial, and this primitive world allows classical computing, but does not allow quantum computing. I should say the difference between these two hypotheses, the gap is very large, so it can be tested. The behavior will be overwhelming already for systems which are built today, and they use the basic noise model for quantum series. I didn't tell you what the noise model is. They are both compatible with quantum mechanics, but this needs at least some discussion. And the pessimistic scenario suggests that quantum supremacy is an artifact of something bad in the modeling of quantum computer. It's not a good model for local quantum systems. So this is since we are talking about the laws, let's try to understand. So okay, we talked, and this is part of the basic of the study of fault tolerance, that quantum systems are noisy. What could be the rule for the noise? Let's see some suggestions. What about the first rule? Every quantum evolution is noisy. What do you think about it? Well, this is problematic, I tell you, from various reasons. First of all, of course, people thought about it. And they thought about it as a modification of quantum physics. So if you add noise in certain way to all the evolutions, then this is a modification of quantum physics. People considered it. It seems unlikely, and also the amount of noise which is compatible with what we know about quantum physics will be so small that we will not have effect on quantum computer. So this is not the type of things we would like to have. Here's two other suggestions which are better. The other thing was said the time-dependent quantum evolution are noisy. You see, even when you talk about a single qubit, the operation, you need to make it time-dependent. You need to allow two types of gates on this single qubit to occur at a random order. And then to say that time-dependent quantum evolution are noisy, this makes sense because the evolution, in order to depend on time, it needs some interruption from the environment, from the neighborhood, from the outside world. And this accounts for noise. So if we find a rule about how time-dependent evolution are noisy, then this makes sense. Of course, this is only a beginning of a long story. Another law is that noise is a necessary ingredient in modeling local quantum system. I told you before, the fact that we cannot just make a device to solve all the problem immediately, one way to understand it is because we are talking about local systems. And most physics we see around us is the interactions are local. They are carried between two particles, or three particles, or one particle. And now we can say maybe locality comes automatically with noise. This is no longer any violation of quantum mechanics. This is just trying to understand the notion of locality. In any case, this is another demonstration of the difference. The optimists, we think that with some effort, the quality of a single qubit can be pushed down as much as they want. When it crosses this green line, the threshold line, then we can have some other machinery to build quantum error correction and to make it improve much better. And there are another approach with some other effort that will give us immediately extremely stable qubit. And here is a pessimistic point of view, which says that we will not be able, even for a single qubit, we will not be able to approach the threshold line, so we will not be able to do quantum error correction, and we will not be able to do topological qubits. Okay, so now we have some dilemma because we are running some, so I want to tell you about two things, or three things. One thing is the mathematical theory which took place in studying these topics. And this theory started with a paper that I wrote before I got interested with quantum computer with two colleagues, Itai Benyamini and Oded Shram, in 1999. And actually one way to describe this paper is to consider voting rules. So, you know, there are many bad things about mathematics, but one good thing about mathematics, we can take the same model and apply it in many different real-time phenomena. And if you remember, in the 2000 election, the results were very sensitive to errors in counting the votes. And we studied this phenomena. Except we studied it in 1999, so we didn't foresee the difficulties in the US election. We studied it for still another model, which is called the model of percolation, maybe some of you. And then we had some insight about which democratic systems are stable, robust to noise, and which are not. And roughly speaking, this is related to what I mentioned before, to this Fourier decomposition. The fact that we can find a very unintuitive way to describe mathematical function, it turns out to be crucial in understanding noise stability and noise sensitivity. And this is a Fourier again. And in any case, I don't want to get into the theorems, and I don't want to get into the much later theorems that I proved with Guy Kindler on quantum. I just tell you in words what this theorem said. And this theorem says that if you try to do the experiment that the Google group headed by John Martini and the IBM group and other groups are trying to do, then when the level of noise is constant, then the systems they build are very primitive computationally. Constant means that every qubit has every qubit has a constant probability to be corrupted. If this is the case, then the system computationally is very primitive. If you go below constant, then the system is very chaotic. And only when you go down to something like constant divided by the number of qubits, then you start to get this supremacy phenomenon. And now this is very interesting, and this suggests that the system these people, so now I can tell you the argument against quantum computers. You can read an interview with me about it in Quantum Magazine some weeks ago, and the argument is very simple. So here is the argument against quantum computers. This is why quantum computers cannot, or this is why I support the pessimistic scenario. This is not a mathematical proof. This is sort of but let me read it to you. Quantum systems without error correction are computationally very primitive. This is the type of thing that arises from the old work with Benjamini and Schramm and the new work with Kindler. And therefore, by the principle that you cannot base supremacy on primitivity. Maybe it's good also in politics. People want to base supremacy not on, please don't try to impress us with something non-primitive, yeah? So no primitive-based supremacy, they cannot lead to computational supremacy. And now come a punchline, an important punchline, both of those are punchline. Quantum error correction is actually harder. Demonstrating quantum error correction is harder than demonstration quantum supremacy. So the systems without error correction, they are primitive. Because they are primitive, we cannot tune their parameter to demonstrate supremacy. And here we have the phenomenon that demonstrating quantum error correction is actually harder. So in order to demonstrate supremacy, you need to control 50 qubits. In order to create quantum error correction, you need to control something like about 150 qubits. Okay, and here is a picture. This is the quantum circuit below the threshold, or noiseless quantum circuit, where the quantum give you an immense power, and here is quantum circuits above the threshold without error correction, where the quantum evolution are extremely primitive computationally. And if you ask how is it possible that Eliezer could come up with a t-shirt with all the rules of physics in one t-shirt, right? One reason is that physical evolution, at least this type of physical evolution, are extremely primitive computationally. The fact that they are primitive computationally does not mean that they are not deep mathematically and they lead to wonderful mathematics. But from the point of view of computational complexity, they are very primitive. It's not that quantum world give us a computational advantage or superiority. It is that the quantum world is basically primitive, and using the mechanism of classical error correction, we can do interesting computation. So if you ask about this argument, what about the efforts of Google, IBM, Microsoft, Intel, Alibaba, Rigetti, D-Wave, quantum circuits, IonQ, NIST, Atos, to reach very stable qubits and demonstrate quantum supremacy? So the answer is they will all fail. Some of them hope to succeed between now and next year conference, so we will be wiser then. Now, what about the white cow? So this was a very nice argument. I should say, this is not reason for them to stop working. This is the type of argument that need experimental support. There are some more detailed, of course, naturally, prediction about what they are trying to do and what they will see. And I'm looking forward. I'm very lucky that they spend so much time. No, this is what I think. This is not a theorem. It is based on some theorem, some heuristic argument. This is what I think. Yeah. And this, I should say, this is what I think, and not so many people think.
Okay, so it's very hard to demonstrate. But you're not saying that it's not demonstrable, that you cannot demonstrate. I mean, you say that demonstrating that quantum error correction is harder than demonstrating quantum supremacy.
You cannot tune the parameters of the circuits to demonstrate quantum supremacy. And if you want to achieve quantum error correction, you need even further tuning. So if this is not possible, then this is also not possible. This is the logic.
No, but I want to distinguish between it's not possible to demonstrate mathematically.
No, there's no mathematics here. It's only statements about physics and engineering.
So it just doesn't happen, is a statement? What? It doesn't happen, or you fail to demonstrate it?
There is here an argument that we have some devices which are very primitive, and because they're very primitive, you cannot use them to demonstrate quantum supremacy, which require 50 qubits, and therefore it's logical to think that since you cannot do it for 50 qubits, you cannot control 200 qubits which are needed for quantum error correction. This is the argument. Okay.
Where did you get 50 from? They get 50 because they tried to build it. 50 is what's...
No, the 50...
No, the 50, I know what the 50, the argument of quantum supremacy they give for 50, but it's also what's achievable today. And whether it's supreme or not also depends on the state of classical computing.
Right.
So I'd like to know where you got the 50 from.
No. The 50...
Maybe you're off. Maybe it's 70. So
maybe
they will
70.
Succeed. And
they won't succeed.
Right in the future.
Look, they won't succeed for 20. The place for my theory to be tested is for 20. Since they will fail for 20 to do something good, then they will also fail for 50.
I'm sorry, but the protocol they're following for 20, they don't demonstrate quantum supremacy in the sense that they could be, that classical computers could also do that.
Right, but you don't need, okay, so if you want to compare classical computer and quantum computer, one thing we know in mathematics and physics, we can do some sort of interpolation. So this is the difficulty they need. This is what classical computer can do. And this is maybe 60. And now I claim that what their machines will actually do is something like this. And if this is what their machine will do, then even for 20 you will see the gap between what they do and what I predict them to do. So they will...
We had Martin's had a version last year.
Who?
John Martin had a version last year which was less than 49.
Yeah, but not, it was a version,
it wasn't 20.
It didn't, it was a car, it was like a car that didn't run. So this version was not, they didn't do the experiment on this version. Anyway, I think expect failure, or expect success. I will expect failure, and we'll see in a year. Let me try to explain shortly the difference. What is different in why this argument fails for classical computer? And the reason this argument failed for classical computer is because this part is false for classical computer. For classical computer, to demonstrate classical error correction, you are happy with the very primitive computational power of these devices that are built. This is a low-degree polynomial. These are very primitive computational devices, but they suffice to demonstrate classical error correction. So there is a conceptual difference between the difficulty of classical error correction or specific form of classical error correction, which amounts to all the robust information we see around us, and quantum error correction.
Is this, I'm not sure what to call it, hand-waving, correct or also applicable to topological quantum computing?
Oh, that's an excellent question, but maybe we leave it for the question because most people don't know. It is correct also for topological quantum, and the reason it's correct is the quantum error corrections people try to build mimic the structure of surface code, which are very closely related to the topological quantum. So it applies to everything I'm aware of, but you need to justify it and you need to explain what they are. Let me just mention, maybe just to provoke. Okay, so it's very interesting to understand why quantum computers will fail. It's also interesting to know what we can learn from it. And this is my last part, which is the beautiful physics above the supremacy threshold. So I try to make some predictions on cats which are consequences from which applies to system above the threshold, and if you cannot go beyond the threshold, apply to in general, like cats could not be teleported. It will be impossible to reverse the life evolution of a cat. One thing which I particularly like, it will be impossible to implement a cat on a device with very different geometry. And also about Frank Wilczek fantasies, it will be impossible to superpose two different living cats. But I should say that in art we can certainly, I don't know if David can see this picture, that's for you. In art we can certainly implement cats on very, very different, and this particular is interesting. This is the artist called Louis Wayne, who devoted his life to drawing cats, and then he unfortunately lost his mental health, and this is reflected by the still beautiful picture. So the summary is the remarkable progress witnessed during the past 2 decades in the field of experimental physics of controlled quantum systems places the decision between the pessimistic and optimistic scenarios within reach, and I expect that the pessimistic scenario will prevail, and this will yield the important consequence also for physics, the theory of computing, and mathematics. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to begin by congratulating Chief Kalai for sharing his pessimism with us, and on a topic that even I began to understand a little. I come from the field of biological physics. In the tradition of this conference, in this meeting, I thought maybe I'll try to project some of what Gil Kalai said onto my own field. And we have a saying that if you can't beat something, exploit it. We have a 4.3 billion years of history in learning to work with noise, right? Biological systems evolved in thermal bath at room temperature. Feynman recognized it in the Feynman's ratchet. Even Maxwell recognized it in Maxwell's demon. Turing himself recognized it in Turing patterns. And I'm curious if such ratchets can build where you can begin to profit from the noise rather than trying to minimize the noise. In the same vein of thought, I wanted to ask a second question, which is biological systems working with the noise have learned a slightly different protocol when it can't beat the noise in entirety. Then what it does is through this chaotic, noisy environment, it has learned to pick out the signal and amplify the signal. So discriminating signal from the noise and then locally amplifying the noise. And I'm curious if these approaches are absolutely silly or if they may help reduce some of the pessimism you shared with us.
I should be very skeptical also about my own pessimism, because I should emphasize this is a fairly small minority view, and even among people who are skeptical about quantum computers, there are different views. So this is a fairly bold view, and there are many ideas how to live through the noise. Even the ideas of quantum error correction, which I didn't elaborate, they in some sense exploit the noise, and there are results which say that if you insist on irreversible computation, so you don't allow noise, then you cannot achieve this. And what they do is that they exploit noise, but they use all the time fresh qubits, which essentially is a complicated method of cooling. So they have very sophisticated ideas, but the point is that at the end, what the results allow you is to say that if you can solve the problem for 500 qubits, then you can amplify it further. And what I say is that you will get stuck before 50 or maybe even before 30 So there is a huge gap in between. I should say that there's no question that denoising and studying noise is a crucial question in many aspects of science, certainly biology, chemistry, understanding the electronic, how do you call it, microscopes, and including some aspects of quantum physics and application of quantum technologies. So I'm talking only about this flagship of quantum computation, but there are other things in quantum technologies, and certainly denoising is a crucial aspect in many areas.
So I had one more question, actually two more. One was, what happened to the white cow?
What happened?
The white cow.
It's a joke. Well, I don't know. It's a joke I heard 30 years ago. Maybe I can answer with another funny story. No, I mean, because this really ties me with, and you know, it's very good that the audience will have something useful to go home with. And I mentioned in the last lecture that my first ever jacket I got from my cousin in South Africa, and from my uncle and aunt from South Africa, whose daughter became a very prominent civil rights activist and politician. And in any case, one thing I noticed in this jacket is that maybe because it was cheap, inexpensive, you know, I have a scientist mind, I tried to find an explanation, the pockets were fake. What do I mean by fake pockets? Is that I cannot put my hand into the pocket. It only looked like pocket, but I can. So this is what I thought for about 40 years. Then 40 years later, I visited London, and I was already in my 50s. I had more confidence in talking to people, and I went to jacket store, and I, you know, talked with and I saw again the phenomena that the pockets are fake, and I told him, you sell jackets, and I realized that you sell fake pockets, probably stuff. And he said, what do you mean fake pockets? And I said, you know, fake pockets, I cannot put my hand into the pocket. It's a fake pocket. And he said, no, this is not a fake pocket. You can go home and you tear it, open it up, and then you can put your hand into the pocket. And I went home to this 40-old jacket, which was completely torn, but the pockets were still in perfect position. And the reason I tell it to you, you know, sometimes you make a wrong conclusion, but usually in the audience there are maybe few people who also thought that these are fake pockets, and they didn't know that you can use scissors to open them. So, especially in Israel, people don't use, I like jackets, maybe because of my cousin from South Africa, but most people, this is frowned upon to dress like this. Okay, so I don't know.
So my last point was, there was quite a bit of discussion. If there was quite a bit of discussion on whether or not in nature computations occur. And I wanted to add to that vast majority of biological systems often compute at the level of single cell, at the level of organism, at the level of ecology. Multiple stimuli are received, transduced, and integrated in order to generate a response. That living systems often generate response by combining multiple inputs rather than learning to live with only one. So computation, I think, are built in to the way we are.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we have a lot of computation in nature. Certainly, we compute in our brain. The word computer, by the way, was used because there were people whose job were computers, and then now we can replace them by computers, at least for some tasks. So certainly, I would say, certainly we see robust information, and we also certainly see computation. It's an extremely interesting problem to understand on the level of computational complexity. What can we say about natural computation? Because this logical-based classes, in some sense, are too inclusive. We don't face general problems. So this is interesting. Thank you.
Can I have a quick question, please, about the comments that you made about biological organisms doing computation
And exploiting noise.
Yeah. I'm wondering if they really do perform computation, or is it our way of perceiving what they're doing?
It's been demonstrated in case of bacteria, for instance. So there are classes of bacteria that can adopt one of two states. Right? And which state to adopt is a response to the state of the cell in which this bacteria invade. So it's kind of a binary system, 1-0 kind of a system. These are two conformational states, or two types, two habits, as it were, right? And they switch, and it's a computation in the sense that it's integrating more than one input to decide. So there is a decision making taking place at the level of an organism inside another organism. All the bacteria in our gut are precisely doing that continuously as we speak.
So in other words, there is a mathematical equation with a very high accuracy to predict how that organism will behave.
Yeah, so I tend to lower my confidence in how deterministic these outputs are. In large number of cases, biological systems tend to integrate signals by rectifying number of stochastic responses, meaning that there is a degree of randomness associated in them, right? So I'm not sure if I'm making sense to you. Yeah. So it's not a completely deterministic computation, but at a population level, there will be a deterministic response arising out of local stochastic fluctuations.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I see the relief on the faces of my fellow social scientists and lawyers in the room that your names weren't pulled out of a hat. So it was a fascinating talk, but I have to confess I lost you at quantum computers are hypothetical devices. So I just want to know, what are the possible, I understand the pessimism, but what if quantum computing succeeds? What are the potential practical applications for that? Because when Big Blue won Garry Kasparov at chess, I thought the computers had already won. So how much, this added computational power, what can it give us? What can it do, both good and bad?
That's also a very good question. I think there are various things that they can do. One thing they can do is to break all the current crypto systems. So or most of the current crypto systems are all the used one. This means that a lot of the things we consider are secure are not secure. There is a lot of effort to try to find the new crypto systems. I think what is considered both the most important application and the motivating application is to do physics and chemistry simulations. So essentially, if indeed the rules, if indeed the systems or materials around us manifest quantum computing algorithms, and certainly if they manifest quantum computing supremacy, then in order to be able to simulate them, and thus to try new molecules, new drugs, and so on, then we need quantum computers. I think this suggests also some good news in both cases. Usually I don't like to, but the fact of the matter is that both if quantum computers are possible and we will build, and if we understand why they are not possible, both these options propose improvement in our ability to simulate natural systems. If quantum computers are impossible, then understanding noise and understanding how in nature the systems are simulated by classical computer can give us computation methods and can give us simulation methods. And on the other hand, of course, if quantum computers are possible and nature behave in this way, then certainly this will be useful this will be a major application. So I think this is considered the most major. But you have to remember, if we will have a device which has a computation power of 300 order of magnitudes, even for specific problems, more than our classical computers, and we never saw such improvement in any aspect of life. Telegraph accounts for maybe 5 order of magnitude. This is mind-boggling, but certainly if this can be done for specific problems, it is very reasonable that heuristic run on this hypercomputer will be useful for many other applications that people use computers for.
Thank you. Why does Alibaba want it?
Why they want it?
Why does Alibaba want a supercomputer? Make me buy things faster?
I would also, if
100 orders of magnitude faster?
I would certainly would like to, look, this is considered a promising technology, and certainly it calls for responsible investment. The research involved is also give prestige and give a signal of the technological ability of the company. So I think it's certainly a reasonable policy for Google, IBM, Microsoft. I remember once I met the very high official in Microsoft. He told me with excitement about quantum computer with another mathematician, Noga Alon, and he even exaggerated about the computational implications. And we asked, well, should Microsoft spend more? And we were both very enthusiastic about it. So I think overall it's a good investment.
I just want to make a point regarding that, because I think a lot of companies, the payoff is not so much in the computer, but in the advertisement that comes out from the fact that they are building a quantum computer.
Okay.
Yeah. First of all, a very fascinating talk, and it's very refreshing to know about a contrarian opinion when we just listen to the whole world saying quantum supremacy is coming tomorrow. So I'm just curious to know that Stephen Hawking recently left us. Did you have anyone to bet about this, whether quantum computing will be successful or not?
Okay, this is also an interesting question. So overall, we all bet on our choices by the career moves we do, which is often amounts for more than some. So there is one bet by a colleague and to some extent a friend of mine who is a strong supporter of quantum computer. This is Scott Aronson, and he offered, I think 5 years ago, actually after I tricked him to do it, $100,000 for an argument which will convince him that quantum computers are not possible. Unfortunately, I was not sufficiently specific in tricking him, so he didn't make this prize only for me, but for everybody. And I think a good way to spend the $100,000 would be to give it as a compensation reward for all the experimentalists who will fail to do what they hope to do, if they will fail to do, and according to the a priori probabilities he did. And then, but again, as I said, it's not so much of betting. There is, by the way, a prediction betting. If you want, you can join, but I'm not very charismatic. After the article in Quanta came out, I saw there were a few more prediction, and the predicted time for a 50-qubit quantum computer became 2 months earlier. So, but I think the fascinating thing about quantum computers is that we are in the time where we will have definite outcomes in the very near future. And I think for a scientist, this is even more important. Being right or being wrong is trying to understand, or at least giving some support whether he's right or wrong. We are closing this to this point.
And just one follow-up question. So you seem to limit yourself within the laws, like the Church-Turing thesis or the quantum mechanical laws, that will remain valid, and you are playing around that safe zone.
No, so I should say the laws are, especially for this lecture and this workshop, the Church-Turing thesis or the effective Church-Turing thesis is not part of my initial ideas or assumptions. I try to find, this is the scientific question, whether it's true or not. So my argument is independent from the efficient to increase this, although it's computational theoretical. I'm very pedantic to stay within the framework of quantum mechanics, although there are many people, when they hear about it, they immediately, their eyes glow and they think that maybe, but I think most physicists who are skeptical about quantum computers, they are themselves quantum physicists. And so I think quantum mechanics is such a wide framework, mathematical framework, that it will support both the possibilities that quantum computers are possible and the possibility that quantum computers are impossible.
So those states are entangled.
What?
Those two states are entangled, yeah. We have okay, yes.
So I think I was planning to say that you're one of the most charismatic, pessimistic people I've ever heard. It's like you convey the pessimistic message so enthusiastically, and really, you can't say you're not charismatic. But so you mentioned the link between the metaphor of the brain as a computer, which in many ways I think nowadays we know that it's not a regular computer. And there's this whole deep, the Blue Brain project in Switzerland, which there's a big debate in neuroscience if really knowing all the connections and transistors and everything will know how the brain works. And pretty much now it's expected it's going to be a waste of money by some. But so if this fails, I mean, did we learn anything interesting about computation? About it? Does it apply to biological system? If it fails, does it apply to? Did we advance science? Because I think that the initial metaphor is the brain as a computer. It's failed, but it advanced what we think about neural computations. But will this help any field, any optimism?
Okay. So there are several questions. First of all, the brain is a computer as a matter of computational model. So I don't talk about computational architecture. As a computational model, it is a computer. The way it works is a different matter. But about failure, I should say that most of my time and most of my experience is an experience of failure, especially in my area of combinatorics, and both failure and even worse, feeling of success, which turn out to be failure, and the wide spectrum around it is more or less the daily. This is the way of life, and this is sort of a different story, but this is an effort of 12 years and more, which may end with a failure. And I think it's not good if I'm overly charismatic, because I think it was the charisma of people who supported the idea of quantum computers that avoid the critical point of view to be explored. And so I'm fairly excited about the fact that we will be much wiser after these systems of experiments.
Okay, I wanted to understand where 20 comes from, and why isn't it 20 plus or minus 500?
No, it's not plus or minus 500.
Where does a pure number 20 come from?
No, so 20 is a sort of educated guess, but it's not. But the theory.
That's all it is, a guess.
All it is. The theory is good enough to say that these primitive devices cannot reach supremacy. But where the failure will be, it will not be 500, because 500 suffices for supremacy. It will be somewhere between 15 or 10 even and 60. And my guess, it will be in the low number rather in the large number. But the theory, the argument, the theoretical argument only tell you these devices cannot achieve supremacy because from the computational point of view, asymptotically,
you're talking about now that's an architecture-dependent statement. If you had topological qubits, they argue, Microsoft, which is building actually a plant to do that, that those are scalable and could very well implement the fault, I mean, will implement the fault tolerant
Okay, so
computation.
this is a good point that I avoided, but I'll get to it. So the point is this, that this argument, okay, we can talk about three targets. One target is to do what Google is trying to do, to use their machines or to demonstrate supremacy for 50 qubits. The other thing we can try to do is, again, what Google trying to do, simply to improve the quality of a single qubit by 2 orders of magnitude. Now, there is even a law, like the Moore law, I think Shortkoff, a famous physicist from Yale, that claimed that every 3 years, the decoherence time will improve by an order of magnitude, and if he is right, then this will also show that I'm wrong. So the question is, why can't you build much better qubits? And there are 2 reasons from this argument. One reason is indirect, because better qubits will allow you to demonstrate with primitive devices superior computation. We don't have precedents for that. This is a principle of computation. Maybe it will be violated. We don't have an example. But the other argument refers to the microscopic process leading to the qubit. The microscopic process leading to the qubit can also be simulated by a quantum circuit. So you will also have the same phenomena, that a noisy quantum system, which demonstrate very primitive computational device, also reach very stable qubit, which we know is harder, heuristically, harder than supremacy. So these are the arguments, and I don't see a way around them, and they apply also for topological qubits. In the laboratory, topological qubit is a gadget which is very similar to the memory of a classical computer. So the gadget itself, it's a fascinating mathematical object, allow to create qubits which are extremely stable. The point is that the microscopic, which is still hypothetical, microscopic process leading to this anionic qubit, which is actually very similar to what Martini is trying to do in the laboratory building surface code, this microscopic process is also an example of a process without error correction that leads to very stable qubits. So the argument applies also on the microscopic level for the process leading to the topological computing.
Sorry, are you trying to argue, if I understand what you're saying, that based on, not a theorem, you're not claiming a theorem, on sort of experience of computational mathematics, that anyons in the laboratory are impossible?
Anionic qubits. I don't say that.
Anionic qubits. Now,
stable anionic qubits
are impossible. So this is a statement about the existence of a physical object, which, as far we not only know is consistent with physics,
there's no
quantum
question.
mechanics. Some people claim to already have created them. They haven't proved that.
No, not stable anionic qubits.
No, sorry. Some people have claimed that there are people who are waiting to prove that what they construct in the laboratory, Majoranas, are actually anyons that are potentially topological qubits. But you're arguing on the basis of computational mathematics that such a physical system is impossible.
Well, I should be a little bit more accurate. I don't claim that, I claim that high quality anionic qubits are impossible. The general claim is, if you give me any proposed phase of matter, so anions are new phase of matters. If you give me any new phase of matters, this argument tell you will not be able to reach it in a very pure state. So you may be able to reach very mixed version of this phase of matter, which can have other quantum representation which obey this computational limitation.
So, but the bottom line is yes, based on computational, not only computational, very simple computational, not even the league of NP equal P, very simple computational argument. This tell you that some things that physicists are believing, they are...
Physicist, I object to
so I will try
computational supremacy.
Okay, I will try to join force with the historian, and we will see what we can do together. Yeah, I will also intuitively object to that, but we will live and see, and then we can think about it.
Okay, sorry, I've become chairman. I'll change a little the system. We have different views. I first want to be sure that both of you have asked what you want. You are saturated, and you are saturated? Okay. So now, please, yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think my question actually might speak to the disagreement that is happening between Professor Gross and the presenter. I was wondering whether we could directly engage with the title of your presentation, which directly engage in the title of your presentation. The title being the laws of physics versus the laws of computation. Is there something inherently different about the way physicists see law and think about law versus the way computer scientists and also mathematicians, because you've engaged with 4 different disciplines, mathematics, computers, science, physics, and to some extent, if I heard correctly, there was some economics as well. So is there something that is inherently in tension between how those 2 disciplinary perspectives take or think about law?
Yeah, so I find it hard to justify the title. I think both the title and the topic, so the topic represents something which is as close as possible to the notion of physical laws. I think the bottom line is that computational consideration do have profound application to the behavior of physical systems. This is the bottom line, and this bottom line may be correct even if this particular prediction, very bold prediction, is wrong. And this also relates to the predictions about cats, because if it is true that we are limited in the quantum circuits that we can build, these have far-reaching consequences. This means that there are systems that we can build, but they are at the edge of what is possible, and then we cannot teleport them, because teleportation requires a somewhat larger circuits. And this is also counterintuitive to what physics. I think some physicists believe that we will, not soon, but eventually see people teleported from one place to another. It also says that quantum system of certain types, for example, non-interacting bosons with maybe 15 bosons, and I'm pulling this number from my sleeve, they cannot be predicted. And this is also, they cannot, in some of them cannot be reversed. You can create one system, one evolution, and you cannot demonstrate the time-reversed evolution. One thing which may appear to some physicists is that if quantum computers are possible, then every quantum evolution you can implement on any type of geometry you want. And this is for computer scientists. This looks completely obvious, but this is far from obvious for physical systems. And the reason and this is not true if you don't have fault tolerance. So if we don't have quantum fault tolerance, there are some systems we can implement only on some geometry, but we cannot implement on another geometry. So there is a profound difference between the physics of systems with quantum fault tolerance and physics of systems without quantum fault tolerance. And I think, in fact, all of my earlier work was not to try to find an argument why there's no quantum fault tolerance, but try to understand the consequences no systems without quantum fault tolerance, without quantum error correction. And there are very interesting consequences, and they may apply to physical systems in nature, even if in somewhere, in some laboratory, somebody can do. But another thing which is extremely mysterious goes back to the motivation of Feynman. Feynman motivation relates to computation in quantum field theory. So he observed that these computations are extremely difficult, and his vision was that this computation will be easy with quantum computers. Now, there are some results in this direction, but there is still, mathematically, we still don't understand the type of computation which are done by physicists in quantum field theory. And since we don't understand them mathematically, also there is a long way to go to be able to prove that a quantum computer can simulate this computation. So this matter relates to various very interesting topics. I agree. Somehow my sentiment about the supremacy of theoretical physicists, as Eliezer can witness over all the years, is I also share this sentiment, especially because I want to do combinatorics and I don't want to be disturbed. And they do great public relations for science as a whole, and they are great people. But it may be the case that these quantum computers and quantum supremacy is a mirage, and the consequence, it's still too much of a miracle to be true.
Thank you for this exciting talk. I didn't get everything, but I'm a bit struck by your language, the words that you're using: mysterious, miracle, prediction, betting, and so on. Actually also struck by the fact that you mentioned that you had published something last year and you're waiting to prove it. How does that kind of, for me it's like you're working in the opposite direction. Wouldn't you first try to prove it and then come with a statement and prove it? Or is this a very naive question?
No. This is a very good question. In fact, I published a paper about 3 puzzles in the meeting point of computation, mathematics, and games. And one of the puzzles was the quantum computer puzzle, the puzzle about quantum computer. Now, I presented there my argument for why certain experiments are going to fail. And the deadline I had was November 30, and the deadline Google set for demonstrating this experiment to be successful was at the end of 2017. So naturally, I was a little bit nervous. But the proof is by experiments that I cannot do myself. So, and the people who do the experiment, they don't do it with the motivation to prove me right, but from other motivations.
So what is an argument then in your discipline?
No, so this is also a good question. So this is not, so here we are talking about applied mathematics. So as you see, this was an argument, an applied mathematics argument. This was an argument based on the model and various heuristic reasoning, which says that something is not possible. And as you say, David was very upset by the assertion that stable anionic qubits are not possible, like any other stable qubits. I have a physical friend, Moti Halborn, that already claimed that he managed to build in the laboratory what's called non-abelian anions. Those are not in conflict with my theory, but if you use them to build stable qubits, then this proved me wrong. And Microsoft spent a lot of effort trying to do it, and we will have to see. But it's usually this way that the experiments, the theory comes before the experiment. I can tell you, for example, when the Higgs boson was found, there were papers predicting that there will be no Higgs boson found, which were published or at least archived a few months before it was found. I think this is the normal and correct way science should go. I don't know, maybe Eliezer thinks differently, but in this case,
What I can remark is not differently, but that actually celebrity physics doesn't always work, because Stephen Hawking was one of those predicting that. Hawking predicted there'll be no Higgs boson. So celebrity physics doesn't always work.
But there were other celebrities to balance him. So, but if you, as a celebrity, want to support my position, yeah, I will.
There was, let's the order. Patrick, you, and then you. That's the order I inherited. So.
Obviously, I couldn't understand much of what you were going to say, so I went to Avi, my colleague, to ask him what I should understand when I listened to you, and he gave me the book that you mentioned that we should go read. And in looking at, you talked about the problem of noise, but when he's talking about the problem of quantum computing, he says, so what's difficult is holding many bits, I guess he means qubits, in a complex entangled state, and it becomes even harder when this quantum state is evolving under computation. Is this a physics problem, and you were more interested in the mathematical problem? Is this something that is surmountable, but the noise problem is insurmountable? So that's my first question. And then the second question is, as you say that this will fail, and let's hope, since you're here, that it will fail. Will those who fail demonstrate in their failure why it had to fail, or is it simply going to be an open-ended process? Well, they didn't quite get it. Will they come to closure? Will the failure be formally demonstrable that it had to fail for your reasons? And then the third question, to go back to Avi's comment, perhaps quantum mechanics needs a revision. Might the failure, or perhaps might the success of a quantum computer suggest that quantum mechanics needs to be revised?
Okay, so let me start with the third question. That I don't think that the framework of quantum mechanics need to be revised. There may be some things about the intuition of quantum physicists and some unwritten beliefs that need to be examined, at least. For example, there is some tendency to believe that every evolution can be written down on a piece of paper, can be implemented. And this is a big question. But so there are a lot of So there are a lot of fundamental questions in quantum physics that may be related both to the success and the failure of quantum computers, but I think the framework will survive with flying colors. Or at least this is my opinion. Now the second question, okay, so you ask about whether noise is a fundamental question or engineering question. And also, what is the book I recommended? No, his book is not on quantum computing. His book, chapter 11 is in quantum computing. There are some other books. This is a very nice book about the connection between mathematics and computer science. And there is a wider question about the connection between computer science, theoretical computer science, and computers and reality, and the reality of computer algorithms, which is interesting. And there's some different of opinions are reflected also. So his book is called Mathematics and Computation, and my paper is called The Three Puzzles on Mathematical Computation and Games. And in some sense, it presents a somewhat different point of view, not only in the case of quantum computers, but to the broader interface between practice and theory. About noise, so again, yeah, so the common wisdom is that any entangled state that you can reach by a sequence of moves by basic gates, every such quantum states can be approximated on the laboratory. this is not a consequence of quantum physics. This is some belief about quantum circuits, and my claim is that this is very much impossible.
Maybe, Patrick, maybe allow, and then we come back to you. That's okay? Okay, please, Parta.
So, thank you. It's a slightly incoherent question, but it's more targeted at Atul, so that I found very interesting as well. In England, there is a saying, one of the first things I heard when I arrived many years ago was that he's too clever by half. It's a very English kind of viewpoint that maybe being smart, too smart is bad. Yeah. Well, there's some, in game theory, in repeat interactions, but with no memory, sort of just bumping into each other. If there are computational costs, energy costs, one can produce examples quite easily that very simple-minded strategies do well against more sophisticated strategies. Now, it's not a theorem. It's hard to know how to pose it as a theorem. But there are examples. Do you have examples like that in biology about organisms? Or have you, or do biologists to see whether, how they, when they're interacting, the organisms interact, whether you end up in a state where the organisms that survive, they're the ones you're observing.
Yeah, so let me see if I got your question right. Are there cases in which are you asking if there is a directed progress arising out of otherwise random fluctuations? On average, no, but if you shrink the time domain sufficiently, you will find examples. So if you were to play dice, on average, the probability is 50-50, which way it's going to go, right? Multiplicity of the system. But if you don't play it for long enough period of time, if you play it for short period of time, then the systems get biased. At every level in cell, there are examples of this interplay between time scale and fluctuations that biology exploits quite profitably to create an appearance of some kind of a progress, as it were, taking place from an otherwise random sort of input forces. Wonder if I'm answering your question. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
You're saving energy.
Al? Sorry, it was you before Al?
I think so.
I lost the... So please give Al the microphone for the next.
My question goes back to what Patrick asked about the open-endedness, potential open-endedness of this controversy between the optimistic and the pessimistic view of quantum computing. And I'm asking this question because how you describe the problem with noise very much reminded me of a controversy that has been going on in sociology forever. In a sense, people are noisy, right? They behave in unpredictable ways, and the ongoing controversy within sociology has been if that noise is manageable by statistical methods, you can, in principle, approach questions about people and society in the same way as natural science does it, or whether noise is just too much, and that's why you need completely different methods, and certain things you will never be able to manage. And of course, this has been going on, and every side produces research, but that doesn't resolve the controversy, because each side just says, well, what you are doing is not actually showing that your thing works. It's just you're doing what you're doing and you're getting something, but this is not a real result. This is not what we would regard as a real result. So I'm asking, well, what happens if it's not possible to produce a quantum computer in 1 year, but then it's the argument, well, maybe we need some more time and we need to consider more things, so maybe it's 5, then it can be infinite, possibly. And then what happens if somebody claims we have it, is there a way to definitely decide if what they have is really what they claim to have? Or would there still be an argument, well, you're doing something, but in some ways it's not sufficient to fulfill the conditions that are derived from my assumptions?
Yeah, so I think all the dangers you point out are possible. But first of all, one thing, if there will be a definite demonstration of quantum supremacy, and even more so if there will be a quantum error correction which will give you stable qubits, or if Microsoft will be able to not just to build this Majorana fermions, Majorana fermions, but to actually build stable qubits based on them, then this will show me a wrong in a definite way. And if they will do something more vague, then we'll have to check it, or actually better, other people will check carefully what they're doing. And on the other hand, repeated failures, also, I don't know, there is another part of this research to try to find the consequences for systems without quantum error correction. And this is interesting regardless of the effort, because for all we know, most systems in nature, we don't have any natural demonstration of this apparatus of quantum error correction. We do have classical error correction in nature in all the places. All the information we see around us, the robust information, is essentially manifest some form of classical error correction, usually very naive form, repetition and some sort of majority rule. And we don't see anything in the quantum world that is similar to quantum error correction. So I think there is more to be done, even if there will not be a decisive. But I should say this is a rare case where there are good prospects that there will be a clear decision, because people, they plan on 2018 to demonstrate quantum supremacy, in 2019 to build surface code with 120 qubits, and the Microsoft also plan to succeed. And I said there is a wide gap between the thing. I think there will be in serious troubles for 20 qubits. So it will be very hard for this position to coexist for a long time. And this is very good from the point of view of bringing this to a decision.
Thank you. So I wanted to come back to this contrast between the laws of physics and the laws of computation. Not so much necessarily the methodology that's used to discover these, but kind of the nature of the contents of the laws and what kinds of laws they are. Because I mean, to have them kind of apparently in conflict is curious, given that they look like different styles of laws. So the laws of computation seem like kind of very general, very abstract, and you might say a kind of top-down kind of constraints on any possible system whatsoever. Whereas it looks, at least at first, like the laws of quantum mechanics that do or don't allow for the kinds of error correction mechanisms that you're interested in are kind of bottom up. They start by saying what kind of thing a system is like and what sorts of kind of evolutions of that system are possible. So it seems like they're kind of different sorts of laws, and they might give rise to different sorts of explanations, kind of top-down explanation versus the bottom-up explanation. So if it turns out that in fact quantum computers are impossible, quantum supremacy isn't possible for the kinds of reasons you give, we might end up in a kind of funny explanatory situation where we have kind of these top-down laws which hold, but for reasons which we can't understand except from the bottom-up level. So is there a tension there?
Okay, so first of all, I should say that the punchline of the lecture is that there is no conflict between, at least in my opinion, and that the laws of quantum mechanics do coexist with both the intuitions and the principle I propose with quantum about computation, except that the conclusion is that quantum supremacy is not possible. And okay, so I think this is a very good point in the following sense. So the question is, how is it possible that that this consideration will tell us something new about physics? You know, they study, these guys are smart people, they study physics for a long time. And the point is that this is the notion of quantum computers, and also, not less importantly, the notion of quantum error correction. There are new notions in theoretical physics, and they allow to see things differently. And they already have people try to implement them to understand the physical phenomenon, not related to the controversy about quantum computers. So it is true that this type of computation, principles about computation, especially those which deal with low-level computation, because the big question like NP not equal to P question, first of all, it's a conjecture, but it doesn't interact well, not with mathematics and not with physics. It's too difficult. Mathematics is, the beautiful mathematics and also physics that we have is somewhat much below the scope of this problem. But the type of systems I'm interested here, which essentially distributions that can be described by low-degree polynomials, very primitive systems, they will tell us an interesting thing about the laws of physics and about noisy quantum systems. So, you know, it may be a little bit unusual. There are also something unusual here from the point of view of computational complexity, because I offer to learn insight from asymptotic statements, which asymptotic means when n go to infinity, and I say let's learn from them on systems with 20, 30, and 40 qubits. So this is not the usual way computational complexity insight are used. There are some examples of this kind, but they are not so common. So we do have here some new things, fortunately. But we don't have an improvement of 300 order of magnitude of our ability.
I would just a moment. I'd like to just point out that you said physics is local, so that gravity exhibits some non-local phenomena, and that is the reason that people are playing with black holes, which are not so easy to create, but as efficient, highly efficient computers, and I wonder if you can comment on that. And then, like Patrick Sri, I'll ask just two questions. I'm wondering, if I give you a quantum supreme machine, can you test it with a classical computer? How would you know I didn't cheat you and gave you a computer which is actually a fraud, and I'm going to kill your business if you're Google?
So okay, these are both excellent questions. Actually, there is a company that claims quantum supremacy using what's called the quantum annealing, and this is a D-wave, and they claim for a while that they can do things better than classical computers. And you know, this is disputed, and people try to check it, and they find the classical algorithm. If your system is based on noiseless circuits, like the serious attempts by, then, as I said, the gap will be so large that it will be difficult. Of course, cheating is always possible. But
is it difficult or impossible?
But you know, if you're talking about the question in principle is very important, whether you can test it, and the point is that we can look at the graph. We can increase the number of qubits, and for a while we can do it with a computer. So if you will be able to perform computations that take me a million CPU time, which of course, a million years CPU time, of course I can do in parallel much quicker, and I test it and it's okay, then this will be fairly convincing. The other question is about black holes, and this is an area where the insight of quantum computer was attempted to use to solve a theoretical physics problem. Indeed, gravity is not local. Maybe it is local based on another tensor power structure that we are not aware of. So we have two quantum computers in our world, or maybe it's not even local with respect to any tensor power or some other mathematical power. But in any case, so quantum gravity is a very big mystery, as you know. But it is nice. There is this paradox, the black hole paradox, and understanding the behavior of black holes, which is a question about quantum gravity, which we can ask, although we know little about, or at least not definite knowledge about quantum gravity. And this is a question that several people ask, and one of them is the late physicist Joe Polchinski. And it's interesting that ideas of quantum computers are attempted to solve this puzzle. I will not tell you what is the puzzle of black hole. It has something to do what will happen to you if you fall into a black hole. So try to avoid it until you feel some more instruction about it. But there is a paper by Hayden and Harlow which use quantum computers, in fact, use the limitation of quantum computers to give some sort of explanation of this paradox. This explanation is fairly problematic, and I should add, the more limitation you have for quantum computer, the better this explanation becomes. So if it is true that stable qubits cannot be created at all, and that the entangled qubits cannot be created without noise or without correlated noise, then this may offer another solution or attempted solution to this paradox. But I should add, this is on a very fundamental level. This is sort of in the border between physics and philosophy, because the mathematical framework for all the theories we are talking about are still not existing. So I hope this is relevant to the question.
Just a quick question. Thinking about deducing scientific laws, it strikes me that to demonstrate unfalsifiability of a negative proposition, I know double negative, to demonstrate that something can never be done requires, is only a tentative answer, right?
It's not.
It can any test will only be tentative.
Well, if we have
so you need a different
decisive, if we can embed this statement in a definite and decisive theory, which will have other predictions that will be demonstrated, then this will be useful. But I agree, my wife said to me many times that it's impossible to prove that something is impossible or something like that. And it has some truth. She's always right, and also I will learn to accept this in due time. What? She's very
Patrick, do you have?
No, I think that my question was repeated by others, and I'm happy.
Okay. Is there any other fellow or mentor who is not yet happy, and that Gil can help him become happy, or her? Okay. If not, thanks you and all the team for wonderful talk.